What if the men who built America were hiding something? Not just secrets of state or classified documents, but deeply personal, deeply human secrets. Affairs, addictions, feuds, fears, obsessions, and contradictions that your history textbook quietly buried somewhere between the Declaration of Independence and a quiz on the three branches of government. You probably picture the founding fathers in marble. Stoic, powdered, perpetually staring into the middle distance with tremendous jawlines and excellent posture. But here's what most people never got to learn. These were real men, complicated, messy, sometimes brilliant, sometimes petty, occasionally drunk men who shaped the most powerful nation on earth while also doing things that would absolutely end a modern political career before lunch. Every secret you're about to hear is drawn from historical records, personal letters, diaries, and the kind of accounts that historians have always known about, but somehow never made it into the version they taught you in 8th grade. These aren't conspiracy theories, these are private lives, finally uncovered. So before we get into it, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because the algorithm is not exactly designed to reward deep historical storytelling, and I need your help making sure these stories actually reach people who want to hear them. Now get comfortable, settle in, and let's pull back the curtain on the men whose faces are carved into mountains and printed on your money. 100 secrets the Founding Fathers never wanted you to know. Let's begin. Number 1. George Washington had a complicated and deeply personal relationship with alcohol, operating one of the largest whiskey distilleries in all of early America. Actually, let's correct the record on something first. Number 1 already appeared at the end of the previous section, so we're picking up from the threads already pulled. The man who distilled whiskey by the barrel also had a domestic life full of surprises, and that's exactly where we're going next. Number 2. George and Martha Washington never had biological children together. This is one of those quiet facts that tends to slip past people because the image of Washington as the father of a nation is so thoroughly ingrained that it's easy to assume the title extended to his actual household. It didn't, at least not in the traditional sense. Martha had 4 children from her first marriage to Daniel Parke Custis, 2 of whom survived to adulthood. When she married George in 1759, those children became part of his world entirely. Washington raised Martha's surviving son and daughter as his own, and later took in her grandchildren after her son Jackie died. George himself fathered no known biological children. Historians have speculated about why. Some believe he may have been rendered infertile by a bout of tuberculosis he suffered in his 20s. Others have suggested the smallpox that scarred him in his youth may have been a contributing factor. Washington himself never directly addressed it in any surviving correspondence, which was very much in character for a man who guarded his private life with the same discipline he applied to military campaigns. What it meant practically was that his household was built entirely around Martha's lineage, her children, her grandchildren, her grief, and her legacy. The family at Mount Vernon was shaped by her first marriage as much as her second, and George Washington, the man who commanded armies and presided over the birth of a republic, built his home around children who carried someone else's name. Number 3. Martha Washington did not arrive at her marriage to George as a woman of modest means looking for stability. She arrived as one of the wealthiest widows in Virginia, and that distinction mattered enormously. When her first husband Daniel Parke Custis died in 1757, Martha inherited roughly 17,500 acres of land, a substantial fortune in cash and investments, and more than 150 enslaved people. She was, by any measure of the era, an extraordinarily powerful figure in her own right. When she married George Washington in 1759, that wealth folded into the Washington household and transformed it. Mount Vernon expanded, George's social standing elevated almost immediately. The Custis estate gave him access to networks, resources, and credibility that his own family's finances simply hadn't provided. It is not a cynical reading of history to note that the marriage was advantageous for Washington in ways that extended well beyond personal affection. That said, by most accounts, they did develop a genuinely close partnership over their decades together. Martha's letters describe deep devotion. Washington's references to her in his correspondence are warm, if typically restrained, but the foundation of that partnership was built on the wealth and enslaved labor Martha brought into it. And that foundation shaped everything about how Mount Vernon operated, how Washington presented himself socially, and how he functioned as a public figure for the rest of his life. The story of George Washington's rise cannot be cleanly separated from Martha Custis's estate, and yet that context has a way of quietly disappearing from the more ceremonial tellings. Number 4. If you have ever heard that George Washington wore wooden teeth, you have heard a legend that is simultaneously very famous and almost entirely wrong. Washington did suffer from catastrophic dental problems throughout his life. By the time he was inaugurated as the first president in 1789, he had exactly one natural tooth remaining in his mouth. But the dentures that replaced his missing teeth were not made of wood. The materials were considerably stranger. His dentures were constructed from a combination of human teeth, which were sometimes purchased from enslaved people at Mount Vernon, ivory from hippopotamus and elephant tusks, animal teeth including those from cows and horses, and metal fasteners, often made from lead alloy or gold wire to hold everything together. The sets were notoriously uncomfortable and ill-fitting, which is why portraits of Washington often show a tight, compressed expression around his mouth. He was not projecting stoic dignity alone. He was also managing the constant discomfort of dentures that shifted, stained, and pressed painfully against his gums. The wooden teeth myth likely emerged from the way ivory and bone dentures discolored over time, taking on a grained, yellowed appearance that may have resembled wood to later observers. The truth is more uncomfortable and more interesting than the myth. It involves real human teeth removed from enslaved people, a detail that American mythology has been particularly reluctant to preserve alongside the powdered wigs and the cherry tree. Washington's mouth was a collision of wealth, pain, and the specific brutality of his era, which is not the kind of detail that tends to make it onto the commemorative plate. Number 5. George Washington loved to dance, and not in a casual get pulled onto the floor at a wedding sort of way. He was seriously, deliberately accomplished at it. In colonial Virginia, formal dancing was not merely entertainment. It was a demonstration of breeding, discipline, and social standing. The ability to execute a minuet correctly communicated something about your education, your self-control, and your fitness for elite company. Washington understood this completely and invested in it accordingly. He was known among his contemporaries as an exceptionally skilled dancer, graceful for a man of his considerable physical size, which stood somewhere around 6'2", at a time when the average man was considerably shorter. He attended dancing assemblies throughout his adult life and was regarded as one of the better partners available at any given social gathering. Martha was reportedly an accomplished dancer as well, and accounts from Mount Vernon events describe the two of them opening balls together with a formality that set the tone for the entire evening. What is interesting about this detail is how deliberately Washington cultivated dancing as a social tool rather than simply enjoying it. Everything about his public presentation was calculated, and his presence on a dance floor was no different. It projected ease, physical mastery, and the easy authority of a man entirely comfortable in his body and in the company of powerful people, which brings us directly to the next layer of that calculation. Number 6. Washington was one of the most image-conscious public figures of his era, and he worked at it with a consistency that feels almost modern. He understood that his physical appearance, the portraits commissioned of him, the way he carried himself in public, and the dignity he projected were all instruments of political power. He was deeply attentive to how he was depicted in paintings. He sat for multiple portraits throughout his life and was known to express dissatisfaction when he felt a likeness failed to capture the gravity he intended to project. Charles Willson Peale painted him. Gilbert Stuart painted him. John Trumbull painted him, and in each case Washington was not a passive subject. He was a participant in constructing a visual legacy. He was also meticulous about his physical presentation in public settings. His clothing was carefully chosen, his posture was deliberate, and the ceremonies he participated in as president were designed with an almost theatrical precision, down to how he would enter a room, where he would stand, and how he would receive visitors. He consulted with advisors about the proper etiquette for a Republican president, conscious that he was setting precedents that would define the office for generations. Too much ceremony, and he risked looking like a king. Too little, and he risked undermining the dignity of the new government entirely. It was a constant balancing act performed in full public view. And when the public eye finally turned away at the end of the day, when the correspondence piled up and the candles burned low, Washington's discipline did not rest. During military campaigns especially, he was known to work well into the night, reviewing intelligence reports, drafting orders, and writing the exhaustive correspondence that kept a revolutionary army functioning on determination and very little else. The image of Washington asleep at a desk is not part of the mythology, but it probably should be. 7. Washington's dog breeding hobby. The same man who obsessed over his public image also obsessed over bloodlines of a very different kind. At Mount Vernon, Washington kept meticulous records of his hunting dogs, tracking their parentage, behavior, and performance with the same almost bureaucratic precision he brought to military logistics. He wasn't just collecting pets, he was deliberately breeding for specific traits, especially stamina, nose, and temperament in the field. Over time, by crossing English foxhounds with other imported and local strains, he helped shape what would eventually become the American foxhound, a distinctively lighter, faster dog suited to the Virginia landscape. His farm diaries list dogs by name, lineage, and even personality quirks, because of course they do. This was Washington in microcosm, methodical, experimental, and quietly intent on engineering an ideal, whether the subject was a republic, a distillery, or a pack of hounds. 8. Washington's whiskey distillery. For a man who has been embalmed in marble and myth, Washington spent a surprising portion of his later years in the liquor business. After leaving the presidency, he didn't retire into quiet philosophical reflection alone. He also built one of the largest commercial whiskey distilleries in early America at Mount Vernon. At the urging of his Scottish farm manager, James Anderson, Washington invested in a large-scale operation that used surplus grain from his fields, especially rye and corn, to produce whiskey by the thousands of gallons each year. This was not a hobby still. It was a major profit center, with 5 copper stills, dedicated enslaved labor, and a distribution network. The product was mostly unaged, harsh by modern standards, sold in bulk rather than bottled elegance. The father of his country was, in very practical terms, also one of its more successful frontier distillers. 9. Washington's greenhouse and gardens. If you picture Washington only in battlefield mud or presidential velvet, you miss the man pacing his grounds with a gardener's eye and a surveyor's mind. At Mount Vernon, he presided over an evolving landscape that functioned as both a showpiece and a laboratory. He built a large greenhouse, an elite luxury in the 18th century, where he experimented with exotic plants and tried to coax non-native species to thrive in Virginia's climate. In his letters and farm reports, he fussed over soil quality, crop rotations, ornamental paths, tree lines, and vistas, endlessly tweaking the estate's layout to balance beauty with productivity. He corresponded with other landowners about agricultural improvements, imported seeds, and new techniques, always looking for better yields or more impressive displays. The grounds at Mount Vernon were not just a backdrop. They were a living statement about order, taste, and the enlightened landowner he wanted the world to see. 10. Washington's fraught relationship with his mother. For all the national mythology about Washington as a marble saint, his relationship with his own mother was decidedly human and often strained. Mary Ball Washington lived well into her son's public career, and their surviving correspondence suggests a dynamic that could be tense, demanding, and emotionally distant. Washington supported her financially, sometimes grudgingly, responding to her complaints about money or circumstances with a tone that veered toward exasperation. Contemporaries described her as strong-willed, proud, and not particularly impressed by her son's fame, which did nothing to soften the friction. Washington, who spent his adult life cultivating control and dignity, was clearly unsettled by a parent he could neither fully satisfy nor easily ignore. The letters that survive hint at obligations fulfilled out of duty more than warmth, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed public figure still had a private son who could not entirely escape family gravity. 11. Washington's private doubts about power. Publicly, Washington is remembered as the man who turned down a crown and walked away from the presidency after 2 terms. And that's true. Privately, in letters and reflections scattered across decades, you can see him circling a deeper anxiety that power once attached to his name and person might corrupt both the fragile Republican experiment and his own reputation. He worried about becoming a symbol around which unhealthy loyalty could crystallize, about being seen as ambitious in a way that echoed the monarchs Americans had just overthrown. During the Revolution and afterward, he repeatedly voiced concern that public adoration could sour into suspicion if he misstepped or if he stayed too long. His constant insistence that he wanted retirement, that he was reluctant to accept office, was not just theater. It was also a method of protecting himself and the idea of the presidency from the accusation that it belonged to him personally rather than to the people. 12. Martha Washington's surviving correspondence problem. For all the detail historians can extract from Washington's official papers, there is a remarkable silence where his most intimate marriage should be. That quiet is not an accident. After George died in 1799, Martha reportedly burned a large portion of their private letters, keeping only a small number that survive today. The reasons can only be inferred. Maybe she wanted to protect his carefully managed image from the messiness of personal emotion. Maybe she wanted to protect herself, or their children, or simply draw a curtain over decades of shared grief, affection, arguments, and anxieties. Whatever her motives, the result is that one of the most consequential partnerships in American history is documented more in fragments and secondhand observations than in the direct voices of the two people involved. We know they cared deeply for each other. We do not know nearly as much as we might have, because Martha chose absence over posterity. 13. Abigail and John Adams's letter archive. If Washington's marriage feels like a carefully guarded room with the curtains drawn, the Adams marriage is more like a house with every window thrown open and the drafts still swirling. John and Abigail wrote to each other obsessively for decades, especially when politics or diplomacy pulled him away, leaving behind one of the richest documentary records of any early American couple. The surviving letters, hundreds of them, move effortlessly from gossip to philosophy, from household logistics to blistering commentary on the Revolution and its leaders. They argue about education, empire, virtue, money, slavery, and parenting, often in the same paragraph, often with a mixture of affection and irritation that feels startlingly modern. Unlike many of their peers, they did not burn most of their private correspondence, which means historians don't have to guess as much. The personal and political life of a founding marriage is written out in their own cramped hands. 14. John Adams's long absences from home. The intimacy of those letters is partly explained by something much less romantic. John Adams simply wasn't home very much. From the Continental Congress in Philadelphia to diplomatic missions in Paris, Amsterdam, and London, his public duties carved huge absences into the fabric of family life in Braintree and later Quincy. Years could pass with only brief visits, if any, while Abigail managed the household, raised children, and endured war practically on the front porch. In the meantime, John lived in boarding houses, foreign courts, and rented rooms, writing home about European politics and personal frustrations, always promising eventual return. Their marriage existed for long stretches as ink on paper, dependent on unreliable ships and precarious mail routes. The separation sharpened everything: his homesickness, her loneliness, their disagreements, and the sense that the new nation was being built at the direct expense of ordinary domestic stability. 15. Abigail Adams's farm management. Back in Massachusetts, Abigail was not just waiting by the window with a handkerchief and a sigh. She was running an enterprise. While John debated constitutions and foreign treaties, she dealt with creditors, coordinated planting, oversaw harvests, negotiated with hired laborers, and managed the work of enslaved and free people attached to the household. Wartime shortages turned ordinary chores into strategic planning, sourcing salt, cloth, and food in a countryside stripped by armies and inflation, trying to keep children fed while prices spiked and currency crashed. Her letters are filled with the language of ledgers and logistics alongside the language of affection, matter-of-factly describing how she bartered, rationed, and made survival decisions. In practice, she was acting as de facto head of household and business manager, a role that blurred the usual gender lines of the era in ways she clearly noticed and occasionally pushed against in writing. 16. John Adams's fear of public humiliation. For all his stern portraits and reputation for stubborn principle, John Adams spent a remarkable amount of time worried about being laughed at. In his private writings, he circled repeatedly around a terror of ridicule and failure, convinced that his enemies and even his friends were ready to mock his ambition, his vanity, his missteps. He fretted about how history would judge him, whether his name would be remembered with honor, or not remembered at all, or remembered for the wrong reasons. When rivals like Hamilton or Jefferson gained influence, he not only argued with their ideas, he anguished over the social slight, the public slight, the possibility that he had been made to look foolish. This sensitivity could make him prickly, defensive, and prone to long, self-justifying explanations in letters, as if he could write his way out of humiliation before it fully arrived. 17. John Adams's habit of emotional candor. Paired with that fear of embarrassment was a surprising willingness to show his emotional seams, at least on paper and especially to Abigail. His letters swing from soaring confidence about his intellect and importance to dark brooding about his insignificance or persecution, sometimes within the same page. He complained freely about colleagues, cursed the vanity of European courts, despaired over his health, and confessed to bouts of melancholy and irritability. Where Washington curated silence and Jefferson preferred polished irony, Adams often wrote in a kind of unfiltered rush, letting anxieties, resentments, and bursts of joy spill out. This emotional candor could be exhausting to those around him, but it also gives a rare, almost diary-like view into the inner life of a man at the center of revolutionary politics. You don't have to guess how he felt about things, he tells you, often in excruciating detail. 18. Abigail Adams's political advice. Of course, those torrents of feeling and analysis didn't just pour outward into a void, they bounced off a sharp, engaged mind on the other end of the correspondence. John didn't merely inform Abigail about politics, he asked her what she thought, and he took her answers seriously. She critiqued his drafts, warned him about popular sentiment at home, and weighed in on taxation, legal reforms, and the dangers of unchecked male authority, all while reminding him to remember the ladies in the new laws. Her observations about neighbors, prices, and local grievances gave him a kind of real-time political barometer he couldn't get in European salons or Philadelphia chambers. In an era when women were formally barred from office and the vote, Abigail's advisory role made her an unusually influential, if unofficial, participant in the creation and critique of early American policy. 19. The Adams family's tragic children. For all the intellectual fireworks in John and Abigail's letters, the story at home turned out far more brittle and painful, especially for their children. The Adams name promised opportunity, but it also came with impossible expectations, long periods of parental absence, and the shadow of a father whose own anxieties about success bled into his parenting. Their son Charles slid from early promise into debt, alcoholism, and estrangement. John finally refused to see him, and Charles died young, leaving behind a widow and children John later regretted not having treated more gently. Another son, Thomas Boylston Adams, wrestled with depression, money troubles, and drinking, struggling to live up to a legacy that seemed to crush rather than lift. Only John Quincy Adams managed to convert that pressure into a sustained public career, and even he carried deep melancholy. The Republican household that produced presidents also produced addiction, illness, and early graves. 20. John and Abigail's separate bedrooms in old age. By the time John and Abigail finally settled into something like a permanent retirement in Quincy, the romance of youth had given way to the logistics of aging bodies. Illness, arthritis, and the lingering effects of decades of stress made sleep a complicated, fragile thing for both of them. Instead of the tidy picture of an elderly couple sharing a bed until death, they drifted into a more practical arrangement, adjoining or nearby rooms, separate beds, coordinated routines that allowed one to rest while the other coughed, paced, or wrote late into the night. Letters from this period talk about infirmities, aching joints, and sleeplessness with the same frankness they once reserved for politics. But the emotional thread between them didn't fray with the linens. If anything, it tightened. Separate bedrooms didn't mean distance so much as adaptation, a quiet acknowledgement that affection sometimes looks like giving the other person a chance to sleep. 21. Thomas Jefferson's book Obsession. If John Adams wrestled with his fears by writing letters, Thomas Jefferson tried to organize his anxieties and ambitions into shelves. From youth into very old age, he bought books with a hunger that bordered on compulsion, accumulating thousands of volumes in multiple languages on everything from architecture and agriculture to philosophy, botany, and music. When the original Library of Congress burned during the War of 1812, Jefferson offered to sell his own collection to replace it, not just as charity, but as a statement that his mind, mapped onto paper and leather, could help rebuild the intellectual core of the Republic. He didn't simply display these books as trophies, he used them to reinvent himself again and again, teaching himself subjects he needed for the latest project. The Virginia planter, the diplomat, the amateur scientist, the constitutional theorist. Each version of Jefferson had a corresponding section of shelves. 22. Jefferson's macaroni machine. Jefferson's curiosity didn't stop at ideas and treatises, it extended cheerfully into his dining room. During his time in Europe, he tasted pasta dishes that were then essentially exotic to most Americans and decided they were worth importing, along with paintings and political theories. He acquired a pasta extruder, a macaroni machine in his words, and experimented with making his own, recording notes on preparation and serving much like he would for a scientific observation. At Monticello, and later in Washington, he served macaroni and cheese-like dishes to guests, helping turn what had been a foreign novelty into a fashionable food at elite American tables. For Jefferson, this wasn't just gourmet indulgence. Cuisine was part of his project of refinement, proof that the new republic could match Europe in taste as well as in philosophy. The same man who drafted declarations also drafted recipes, tinkering with pasta shapes and sauces in between political debates. 23. Jefferson's rotating bookstand, surrounded by mountains of books and an endless appetite for cross-referencing them. Jefferson did what he often did when faced with a practical problem. He designed a gadget. His rotating bookstand was essentially a wooden carousel that held several open volumes at once, allowing him to spin from one text to another without stacking them precariously on the table. It was a small, almost whimsical device, but it reveals how he imagined the act of reading, not as a linear march through a single volume, but as a constant conversation among multiple authors. The stand fit neatly into a larger pattern of Jeffersonian contraptions, swivel chairs, copying machines, dumbwaiters, all aimed at smoothing the friction between thought and action. He wanted knowledge to be at his fingertips in the most literal way, so that his mind could ping from classical history to French law to horticulture without losing its place or its patience. 24. Jefferson's mockingbird in the White House. For all the portraits of Jefferson as a cool, controlled thinker, there was also the man who let a small bird hop across official documents. He kept a pet mockingbird, often identified as one named Dick, that reportedly flew freely through his spaces, perched on his shoulder, and sometimes sang while he played the violin. During his presidency, the bird was a kind of unofficial, feathered roommate in the White House, cutting across the stiff formality of early American politics with flashes of song and mischief. Visitors later recalled the surprising informality of this arrangement. The President of the United States with ink-stained fingers, a book open, a mockingbird balanced nearby. Whether embellished or not, the story rings true to a pattern in Jefferson's life, an affinity for small, semi-domesticated nature in the middle of carefully controlled environments. The man who helped design grand political architectures still made room for a bird that refused to follow any script. 25. Jefferson's wine cellar. The same man who wrote frugality into Republican virtue also spent like a European aristocrat when it came to wine. From his first diplomatic posting in Paris, Jefferson treated French vineyards almost like a second university, traveling to Bordeaux, Burgundy, and the Rhone, taking meticulous notes on soils, slopes, and flavors. He ordered by the cask and by the case, cultivating relationships with specific chateaux, insisting on certain years, recording prices and shipping routes in a small blizzard of correspondence. Back in America, he tried to introduce these tastes to an English ale and rum culture, stocking Monticello with Madeira, claret, and champagne, then serving them as part of evenings that blended politics, philosophy, and careful pairings. He tried, repeatedly, to establish European-style viticulture in Virginia, importing vines, consulting experts, urging neighbors to experiment. Almost all of those experiments failed. What didn't fail was his appetite. Even when creditors circled, Jefferson kept ordering new shipments, explaining, rationalizing, but rarely actually cutting back. 26. Jefferson's mountain retreat bed alcove. At Monticello, even where Jefferson slept was an experiment in efficiency and control. Instead of a grand, freestanding bed dominating a room, he had a built-in alcove bed tucked directly into the wall, set between his cabinet, his small private study, and his larger bedchamber. He could literally step out of bed in one direction into public-facing space, or in the other into a tight cell of books, instruments, and papers. The design saved floor space, but it also made sleep part of a continuous circuit of work and reception. Wake, slide into the study, write, or dress and emerge into the more polished room prepared for visitors. Pull-out steps, cubbies, and hooks turned the alcove into a kind of wooden machine for living, optimized to minimize wasted movement. In the middle of the night, Jefferson could reach for a book or a notebook without really leaving the cradle of wood. Privacy, such as it was, existed in inches, not rooms. 27. Jefferson and Martha Wales Skelton's marriage. Before the mythology of Jefferson the widowed sage, there was Thomas and Martha, two young Virginians building something that looked almost ordinary. Martha Wales Skelton came to the marriage as a wealthy widow with property, enslaved people, and complicated inheritance, tangles that would shape Jefferson's finances for the rest of his life. Their years together at Monticello were marked by pregnancies, miscarriages, and long stretches of domestic seclusion, while the revolution churned in the background. Surviving letters and recollections suggest real affection. Evenings of music with Jefferson on the violin and Martha at the harpsichord, shared reading, shared grief as children died. Yet the marriage lasted barely a decade. Martha's health, already fragile, declined with each pregnancy until she died in 1782 after their sixth childbirth. Jefferson's political career exploded only after she was gone, leaving historians to speculate how different his public trajectory might have been if she'd lived to temper or redirect his ambitions. 28. Jefferson's promise at Martha's deathbed. According to family tradition, the final days of Martha Jefferson's life were framed not just by illness, but by a very specific request. She had watched her mother's misery as a second wife in a blended plantation household, watched half-siblings compete for affection, watched property and children move like chess pieces after remarriage. On her deathbed, the story goes, she made Thomas promise he would never marry again, sparing their own daughters the same fate. There is no signed document, no diary entry in his hand, only later recollections by relatives who claim to have heard him tell it, but his behavior afterward fits the tale. Jefferson plunged into a period of almost incapacitating grief, shut himself away, then emerged to a life that, while full of romantic rumor, never included another wife. Whether we take the promise as literal or symbolic, it cast a long shadow over his household, leaving Monticello permanently balanced between widower's shrine and bachelor's experiment. 29. Jefferson's violin practice. Long before Jefferson was famous for sentences, he was known in Virginia for bowstrokes. As a young man, his violin was not a casual pastime. He practiced enough to play complex European pieces, to accompany small chamber groups, to entertain guests, and most memorably to court. Family stories claim that evenings of shared music with Martha, the two of them trading melodies and glances, did as much to secure their engagement as any speech he might have given. Even later, in Paris and Philadelphia, the instrument traveled with him, a portable refuge and social tool that bridged the distance between intellectual conversation and something more purely sensory. Then, in middle age, an accident often described as a fall from a horse injured his wrist badly enough that sustained playing became difficult, then impossible. Losing the violin didn't remake his public life, but it quietly removed one of the most intimate rituals of his private one, the daily discipline of drawing sound out of silence. 30. Jefferson's private finances. From the outside, Jefferson looked like the very picture of landed stability, a mountaintop estate, enslaved laborers, books, wine, inventions, a rotating parade of guests. On paper, the reality was far more brittle. Inherited debts from his father-in-law's estate, his own taste for European goods, chronic underperforming agriculture, and the constant expenses of hospitality and politics combined into a financial trap he never fully escaped. He borrowed against future crops, against enslaved people, against land values that did not always rise as optimistically as he predicted. He bought more books, more wine, more furnishings, often convincing himself each purchase served the Republic or his intellectual work. Over time, interest piled on interest, and every attempt at financial reform collided with his unwillingness to dismantle the social world he'd built. By the time he died, the sage of Monticello left behind not a secure patrimony but a financial wreck that required selling the estate and many of the people who had labored there. 31. Jefferson and Sally Hemings correspondence gap. For a relationship that has generated more ink than almost any other in Jefferson's private life, the paper trail between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings is almost eerily blank. We have Jefferson's letters to merchants, to cabinet secretaries, to minor European wine dealers, to distant cousins about crop rotations, but not a single surviving note in his hand addressed to her, nor anything in her handwriting addressed to him. What we do have are circumstantial shadows, plantation records that show when she was at Monticello and when he was there, travel logs that line up births with his returns from Philadelphia or Washington, and the recollections of other enslaved people, especially their son Madison Hemings, who described his mother's long association with Jefferson in clear, unembellished terms. Historians argue over what that silence means. Some suggest Jefferson, a compulsive saver of paper, deliberately avoided written communication to limit evidence of an already fraught relationship built on an unbridgeable power imbalance. Others suspect letters once existed, only to be quietly destroyed by family members desperate to preserve a different image of the patriarch. The result is a kind of archival negative space. We can map Jefferson's thoughts on architecture down to the angle of a staircase, but when it comes to how he addressed the woman who bore several of his children, we are left reading around the edges, reconstructing an intimate world from account books and third-hand memories instead of direct, private words. 32. Contested views before DNA on Jefferson and Hemings. Before the late 20th century DNA tests that linked Jefferson's male line to the descendants of Eston Hemings, the question of whether Thomas Jefferson fathered Sally Hemings's children was less a historical puzzle and more a running cultural argument. In the 19th century, his white descendants and defenders dismissed the idea, treating it as a political smear first circulated by journalist James Callender, who had published the accusation during Jefferson's presidency. Pro-Jefferson biographers framed the story as slander unworthy of serious consideration, while pro-slavery writers sometimes weaponized it to paint abolitionists as hypocrites, insisting that intimate ties between masters and enslaved women were natural, even benign. Meanwhile, oral traditions within black families connected to Monticello quietly maintained a very different story, passing down names, dates, and impressions of a shared ancestry that white historians often refused to treat as evidence. By the mid-20th century, a few scholars began taking the Hemings accounts more seriously, noting the suspicious regularity with which Hemings's children were conceived when Jefferson was at Monticello, and not when he was absent. Still, many of the most influential Jefferson scholars clung fiercely to alternative explanations, suggesting any Jefferson male, one of his nephews, for instance, might be responsible anything to keep the sage himself untouched. The debate exposed more than just uncertainty over paternity. It revealed how race, power, and hero worship shape what counts as believable. Only when DNA testing narrowed the possibilities did the historical mainstream begin to shift, not because new stories emerged, but because old ones long marginalized suddenly met a standard of proof the Academy could no longer easily sidestep. 33. James Madison's delicate health. If Jefferson moved through the world like a tall, restless stork, James Madison arrived more like a nervous sparrow, small, pale, and frequently unwell. Even as a young man at Princeton, classmates remembered him as brilliant, but physically fragile, subject to what contemporaries called bilious attacks, bouts of exhaustion, and episodes that sounded suspiciously like seizures or panic spells. He stood barely over 5 feet 4 inches, his voice thin, his frame slight enough that political opponents mocked him as Little Jemmy, the bookish theorist who might wilt if he had to swing a sword. Madison himself seems to have worried as much as anyone. In private letters, he referred to his constitution as feeble, fretted about the strain of long journeys, and wondered aloud whether the physical demands of public office would simply grind him down. That chronic sense of bodily limitation shaped the way he approached politics. Where other founders sought stages and battlefields, Madison gravitated toward desks and drafting rooms, toward the slow, invisible work of constructing arguments, coalitions, and constitutions. His illnesses forced him into patterns of rest and withdrawal that sometimes looked like weakness to contemporaries, but they also created long stretches of enforced quiet, where he read, annotated, and refined ideas instead of racing from one speech to the next. In a political culture that often equated manhood with robust physical display, Madison's self-awareness about his limits became both a source of private anxiety and a quiet engine pushing him toward the kind of influence that didn't require a booming voice or a soldier's swagger. 34. Madison and Dolley Madison's contrasting personalities. Put James Madison alone in a room, and you might find him buried in a book, half murmuring to himself about political theory. Put Dolley in the same room, and within minutes you'd have a small, buzzing society forming around her. The contrast was so sharp that friends and foreign visitors commented on it constantly. He was reserved, almost shy in large gatherings, more comfortable negotiating clauses than charming crowds. She was vivid, tactile, given to bright turbans and ready laughter, able to remember names and personal details across a wide circle of acquaintances. Together, they turned that difference into something like a political technology. Madison could draft the arguments, calculate the vote counts, and think 3 moves ahead in legislative chess. Dolley could soften the edges, bring rivals into the same parlor, and make them feel, if not friendly, at least less inclined to open war. At the president's house, her weekly receptions became known as squeezes, packed events where members of Congress, foreign diplomats, and local notables jostled shoulder to shoulder in a space that felt more like a crowded living room than a formal court. Madison's quiet presence at the edge of those evenings, watching and engaging in small, targeted conversations, depended on the fact that she had already done the social work of making people feel welcome. Their marriage was not just an emotional partnership, but an operational one. His introspection and occasional gloom were balanced by her sociability and optimism. His dense, careful logic needed her ease with human temperature. In an era before political consulting firms and focus groups, the Madison household functioned as an early prototype of private life harnessed deliberately to public influence. 35. Dolley Madison's social strategy. Dolley Madison understood that in the fragile early republic, where parties were still forming and old revolutionary friendships could turn into bitter feuds overnight, the person who controlled the room often controlled more than the evening. She used hospitality the way other politicians used floor speeches. Her drawing rooms were carefully curated spaces where Federalists and Democratic Republicans might find themselves sharing the same punch bowl, introduced not as enemies but as guests under her protection. She learned who couldn't stand whom, then orchestrated seating charts and conversational clusters to diffuse, rather than ignite, those tensions. Small, seemingly trivial gestures, a remembered family illness, an offered plate of sweets to a political widow, a kind word to a snubbed junior congressman, built reservoirs of personal goodwill that Madison could quietly tap when votes were close or tempers high. Foreign observers sometimes mistook her warmth for mere sociability, but domestic insiders knew better. Invitations from Dolley carried political weight. Being left off her guest list could feel like a form of exile. She also blurred boundaries between the ladies' sphere and hard politics. Women who attended her gatherings sometimes served as informal channels of information between households, carrying impressions and arguments home to husbands, brothers, and fathers who held office. Dolley didn't draft legislation or argue cases in public, yet through the steady, deliberate craft of entertaining egg punches, card tables, late-night conversations framed by candles and laughter, she engineered a quieter form of leverage. The alliances that seemed to grow casually over her tea service often reflected a great deal of unseen calculation. 36. Madison's Princeton collapse. James Madison arrived at the College of New Jersey, what we now call Princeton, like a man trying to outrun his own physical limitations through sheer force of will. He compressed the standard course of study into an accelerated schedule, devouring Latin and Greek, philosophy and history, staying up late, rising early, and pushing through the headaches and bouts of weakness that had trailed him since adolescence. For a while it worked. Classmates and tutors alike recognized his brilliance, the speed with which he could grasp complex arguments and then turn them around to probe their weak points. But the human body has its own veto power, and sometime near the end of his studies, Madison hit a wall. Accounts differ on the exact symptoms. Some speak of a nervous indisposition, others of a severe illness that left him dangerously thin and shaken, but all agree that he left Princeton exhausted, closer to a physical and emotional breakdown than a triumphal march into the world. Back home in Virginia, He convalesced under the watchful eyes of his family, haunted by the sense that he had come close to permanent damage. That scare echoed for years. When he later weighed whether to pursue a ministerial career or a life in politics, Madison's memories of near collapse at Princeton made him wary of any path that might demand constant public strain. The experience also seems to have deepened his empathy for vulnerability, feeding the strand in his political thought that worried not just about what majorities wanted, but about how easily the frail, the unpopular, or the outnumbered could be crushed if a system wasn't carefully designed. Out of that early private brush with his own limits came a lifelong preoccupation with building structures strong enough to protect others' weaknesses. 37. Madison's fear of religious intolerance. For all his reputation as the great architect of checks and balances, James Madison reserved some of his starkest, most urgent language for questions of religious freedom. In public, he wrote the famous memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments, a blistering argument that state-sponsored religion inevitably slid toward persecution, but his private letters show something even more raw, genuine dread of what he called ecclesiastical establishments sinking their roots into government. Growing up in colonial Virginia, he had watched Baptist preachers jailed and whipped for unauthorized sermons, seen how an official Anglican church could turn spiritual disagreement into a civil crime. Those early images lodged deep. Decades later, he was still warning friends that even 3 pence of tax for religion was a wedge that could crack open into coercion. In letters, he imagined minorities hounded, conscience policed, public opinion whipped up by preachers seeking power as much as salvation. To him, it wasn't a theoretical worry. It was a cycle he had already seen on a smaller scale, and feared would simply repeat on a national one if the Constitution left any loophole at all. The idea that government might prescribe prayers, fund favored churches, or punish unbelief sat in his mind next to other nightmares, factions, demagogues, mobs, but religious compulsion had a special horror. It warped not only politics, he thought, but the inner life itself, turning what should be voluntary search for truth into something closer to extortion. When he pushed for the First Amendment's religion clauses, he wasn't just indulging Enlightenment abstraction. He was trying to bury, in legal stone, the ghosts of jailed preachers and court-mandated doctrine he'd known in his youth. 38. Dolley Madison's Quaker upbringing. Dolley Payne didn't begin life as the glittering hostess of Washington. She began in a world of plain dress, plain speech, and strict expectations. Born into a Quaker family, she absorbed early the quiet rhythms and communal discipline of that tradition, the unadorned meeting houses, the emphasis on inner light over outward show, the suspicion of vanity and worldly ambition. As a girl and young woman, she wore the sober clothes, kept the prescribed silences, and moved within a relatively closed circle governed by elders who monitored behavior closely. That upbringing left traces that never really faded. Her knack for reading a room in silence before speaking, her habit of listening intently while others talk themselves out, her sense that communities are built as much on shared restraint as on shared enthusiasm. But life pulled her away from the meeting. Her first marriage to a Quaker lawyer named John Todd ended abruptly when yellow fever swept Philadelphia, killing him and one of their children in a matter of days. Widowhood pressed her into choices the Quakers didn't entirely approve, and when she married James Madison, an older, non-Quaker politician immersed in the worldly tangle of national power, she effectively stepped outside the bounds of her religious community. Officially, the Quakers disowned her for the marriage. Unofficially, she carried with her an internalized sense of moral seriousness that coexisted, sometimes uneasily, with the bright turbans, fashionable gowns, and crowded salons that came later. The woman who presided over squeezes in Washington still had, in some corner of her mind, the memory of sitting in silence on hard benches, searching for an inward guide, a tension between simplicity and splendor that gave her public charm an oddly grounded core. 39. Madison's Orange County retreat. Long before work from home became a phrase, James Madison perfected his own version of it at Montpelier, the family estate in Orange County, Virginia. While other politicians chased applause in crowded halls, he seemed most himself walking the ridgelines of his property, disappearing into his library, or hunkering over letters that carried his mind far beyond the red clay fields outside. Montpelier wasn't just a residence, it was a retreat in the old sense of the word, a place to withdraw and recalibrate after the relentless demands of public life. There, surrounded by the Blue Ridge in the distance and the daily routines of a working plantation up close, he read European political theorists, ancient histories of republics that had risen and fallen, and the latest pamphlets from American printers. Visitors recalled evenings that stretched late into the night around the dining table, where Madison, freed from the stiff protocols of the Capitol, would unwind into dense, intricate conversation, dissecting constitutional questions or foreign affairs in measured, almost clinical detail. He preferred that intimate arena. No balconies, no shouted slogans, just a small audience and many books within arm's reach. The contrast with the theater of Washington could be stark. In the Capitol, he had to project authority from a small, strained frame. At Montpelier, he could simply inhabit his role as thinker, annotator, and correspondent, sending out long, careful letters that sometimes carried more political weight than a dozen speeches. For a man anxious about his physical stamina, the estate also offered a controlled environment. Walks he could regulate, routines he could manage, spells of illness he could ride out among family and familiar servants. It was both refuge and workshop, the quiet engine room, where much of his visible statesmanship was actually forged. 40 Madison and Dolley's financial troubles. For all the glitter of their Washington years, the Madisons' private finances were a slow-moving disaster that only fully revealed itself after James's death. Montpelier looked grand from a distance, but beneath the surface the plantation economy was straining. Depleted soil, fluctuating tobacco and wheat prices, debts that rolled forward from one season to the next, and an aging enslaved workforce that the family, entangled in its own contradictions, couldn't or wouldn't sell off en masse. Madison, like many Virginia planters, often lived more on credit than on cash, leaning on loans, sureties, and the expectation that future harvests or land sales would even things out. They rarely did. He also made unwise choices trying to help struggling relatives, signing notes he shouldn't have, extending guarantees that came due at exactly the wrong moments. When he died in 1836, the legal and financial tangle he left behind fell heavily on Dolley, who was suddenly an elderly widow trying to keep up appearances in a world that remembered her as the queen of earlier receptions, but didn't see the unpaid bills piling up on her table. She sold off parcels of land, precious household items, and eventually Montpelier itself, piecing together enough to survive, but never quite escaping creditors. Even the enslaved people she had known for decades became, in probate and sale documents, lines of property used to balance accounts, a grim reflection of how thoroughly that system trapped everyone it touched. In Washington, she tried to maintain a social presence, renting modest rooms, entertaining old friends, and trading in memories that sometimes had more market value than her remaining assets. Behind the legend of the woman who saved Washington's portrait of George Washington from the burning British lay a quieter story of pawned heirlooms, desperate letters asking for advances, and a last chapter marked less by triumph than by relentless, humiliating arithmetic. 41. James Monroe's severe war wound. Before he was a president, James Monroe was a very young officer nearly bleeding to death on a Revolutionary War battlefield. At the Battle of Trenton in late 1776, he led a small advance guard in the daring Christmas night crossing of the Delaware, one of the moments later painted into national myth. The painting usually shows him upright, heroic, standing near Washington in the boat. The reality a few hours later was far less picturesque. During the clash with Hessian troops, Monroe took a musket ball high in the shoulder, near the chest, a wound that severed an artery and left him, by some accounts, moments from dying. A volunteer doctor clamped the artery with his fingers until someone could improvise a tourniquet. The ball lodged deep, stayed in his body. The injury nagged at him for years, pain, limited movement, the lingering reminder that his body had once come close to giving out entirely in the service of a cause that, at that moment, still looked shaky. Unlike Madison, whose frailty was more congenital and chronic, Monroe's sense of physical vulnerability came from a single, searing trauma. It colored the way he thought about war long after. He had seen up close how quickly glory turned into groaning men on frozen ground, how much of survival depended on luck and the steadiness of whoever happened to be near you when you fell. When he later served as Madison's Secretary of War and then as president overseeing fragile post-war defenses, he carried that memory with him, not as a tale for public speeches but as a private measure of what military decisions really cost in blood. 42. Monroe and Elizabeth Cartwright's glamour. If Madison and Dolley turned sociability into a kind of soft power, James Monroe and his wife, Elizabeth Cartwright Monroe, added a different ingredient to the mix, a touch of European-style glamour that startled a still rough Washington. Elizabeth came from a New York Loyalist-leaning family with mercantile ties, and when she married Monroe, she stepped into a life that would carry her across the Atlantic as the wife of a diplomat in France, Britain, and Spain. In Paris during the French Revolution, she navigated courtly circles with a composure that impressed observers who were used to American visitors looking slightly out of place among powdered veterans of Versailles. She adopted and adapted European fashions, elegant gowns, carefully arranged hair, a polished manner that balanced reserve with warmth, and when the Monroes returned to the United States, that cosmopolitan polish came with them. In Washington society, Elizabeth could seem distant compared to the effusive Dolley Madison, but that distance read, to some, as aristocratic poise. She hosted with an eye to ceremony, shaping receptions that felt more like small courts than crowded living rooms, complete with subtle hierarchies of access that flattered some guests and frustrated others. Foreign diplomats used to European capitals often found comfort in the familiar cues of her style. Domestic critics sometimes grumbled that the presidency was sliding toward monarchy every time they saw her sweeping entrance or carefully controlled guest lists. Yet for all the whispers, her presence signaled something Monroe quietly wanted the young republic to project: stability, confidence, a sense that American leadership could hold its own not just in treaties and trade, but in the softer realm of manners and culture. Behind the scenes, she was also a partner in the emotional sense, sharing with Monroe the strains of long service, the losses of children, and the constant evaluation that came with public life, all while maintaining a surface that told visitors, in fabric and gesture, that the United States had learned how to dress power as well as wield it. 43. Elizabeth Monroe's preference for privacy. If Dolley Madison built a political empire out of crowded drawing rooms and perpetual small talk, Elizabeth Monroe guarded her doors like a fortress. The contrast struck contemporaries immediately. Where Dolley embraced what one observer called the blaze of company, Elizabeth seemed to recoil from it, preferring carefully controlled gatherings with limited guest lists and rigid etiquette. Some of it was temperament. She was naturally reserved, shaped by years in European diplomatic circles where discretion was survival, not just a personality quirk. Some of it was health. She dealt with recurring illnesses that made the endless whirl of receptions feel more like punishment than duty. And some of it was simple protectiveness of her family's inner life. She was wary of letting Washington gossip seep into her parlor, determined that her husband's presidency would not consume the last bits of their private world. Washington society, accustomed to access as a form of currency, bristled. Rumors spread that the Republican court had turned cold, even haughty. But behind those complaints lay a quieter truth. Elizabeth was deliberately drawing a line, insisting that the presidency did not entitle the public to every corner of the president's home or heart. In a city that was already learning to confuse visibility with virtue, her refusal to perform constant availability read as a kind of soft rebellion. 44. Monroe's Paris household. When James Monroe accepted the post as American minister to France, he didn't just pack trunks. He transplanted his entire young family into the pressure cooker of revolutionary Paris. Their household quickly became a curious hybrid space, part American outpost, part salon, part safe harbor in a city where yesterday's fashionable hostess might be tomorrow's prisoner. Elizabeth, with her poised manner and facility for languages, learned it to navigate shifting factions, hosting carefully calibrated dinners where royalists, Republicans, and foreign observers might sit uneasily within sight of one another, each scanning for signals of where American sympathies lay. The Monroes absorbed more than just politics. They acquired a taste for French clothes, furnishings, and food that would later make their Washington home feel distinctly continental. Their daughter Eliza, a child in Paris, watched her mother move through diplomatic circles with an eye for ceremony that left its mark on her own sense of what proper society should look like. The household also stood at fault lines of real danger. Monroe's controversial visit to the imprisoned Marie Antoinette's friend Adrienne de Lafayette, Elizabeth traveling in person to show solidarity, wasn't just a romantic story. It was a calculated risk in a town where alliances could be read as treason. Letters home described the family living against a backdrop of executions, shortages, and rumor, yet still trying to maintain a semblance of domestic normalcy. Lessons for the children, shared meals, a rotating cast of homesick Americans at the table. That Paris experience etched deep grooves in their habits. When the Monroes later returned to the United States, their sense of ceremony, caution, and taste had been tempered in a place where etiquette and survival had been tightly, sometimes terrifyingly, intertwined. 45. Monroe's personal debt burden. Behind James Monroe's image as the steady, almost stolid statesman of the era of good feelings lurked a quieter, gnawing reality. He was chronically, painfully short of cash. Like many Virginia planters, he built his social and political world on land, enslaved labor, and credit, assets that looked substantial on paper but turned out to be volatile and, in his case, catastrophically illiquid. His long years in public service compounded the problem. Diplomatic posts in Europe, the governorship of Virginia, cabinet positions, and ultimately the presidency all came with expectations of hospitality that official salaries never really covered. Entertaining foreign dignitaries, maintaining appropriate dress, keeping a household large enough to support his role, these costs often flowed directly from his own pocket. He borrowed to keep up, confident that reimbursements from Congress or the sale of distant lands would eventually arrive. They often didn't, or arrived too late. By the time he left the presidency, Monroe was tangled in a web of claims against the federal government for expenses he believed he had fronted personally, and in debts to private creditors who were far less patient. He sold land, mortgaged Oak Hill and his remaining properties, and spent his later years shuttling between legal arguments and appeals for relief, a former president reduced to almost supplicant status before the legislature he had once helped shape. The psychological weight of that strain shows in his correspondence. A man who had given decades to the Republic, now forced to itemize dinners and carriages as if begging for reimbursement. His case became a cautionary tale about how the new nation treated its servants, honor in speeches, but often neglect in ledgers. 46. The Monroe's daughter Eliza at the White House. When chronic illness limited Elizabeth Monroe's ability to stand for long receptions or endure endless social calls, their daughter Eliza stepped into a role that both suited and complicated her. Eliza Monroe Hay had come of age in the refined yet turbulent orbit of European courts and embassies. She had watched French aristocrats, British hostesses, and diplomatic wives choreograph evenings where every seating arrangement signaled something. In Washington, she brought that same sense of hierarchy and formality to the presidential mansion, often acting as de facto White House hostess. The result impressed some and irritated others. Guests used to Dolley Madison's open-armed warmth and near-democratic mixing found Eliza's stricter guest lists, precise introductions, and clear social gradations chilly, even imperious. She could be sharply conscious of rank, particularly when it came to foreign dignitaries and established families, and reports circulated of perceived slights, snubbed wives of congressmen, provincial visitors left off invitation rolls. Yet from Eliza's perspective, she was protecting her parents, especially her ailing mother, by imposing order on chaos, running the Republican court, according to rules she believed would command respect abroad and prevent the presidency from looking haphazard at home. Her letters show real devotion to both parents and a stubborn streak that resisted being coached by Washington insiders. In her hands, the White House became less a bustling open house and more a carefully stage-managed drawing room, a shift that would fuel later narratives about the Monroes being aloof, but also hint at the quiet labor of a daughter trying to hold together image, etiquette, and family under demanding circumstances. 47. Alexander Hamilton's orphaned childhood. Long before he wrote financial reports that made congressmen's eyes glaze over, Alexander Hamilton was a boy staring at a future that looked brutally short. Born out of wedlock in the Caribbean, he watched his parents' relationship collapse under legal and social pressure, then saw his mother die of illness when he was still in his early teens. His father had already drifted away. The death left Hamilton and his brother effectively orphaned, living amid the ruins of a small mercantile operation on St. Croix. Local courts seized what little property there was, and a bout of sickness nearly killed him as well. The combination of stigma, poverty, and loss seared itself into his sense of the world. In a surviving letter from his youth, he wrote with eerie calm about wanting to rise from the groveling condition of a clerk and win fame in some future war, as if ambition were a lifeline he had thrown for himself. Without a stable family network or inherited wealth to lean on, he learned early that the only capital he could reliably claim was his own energy and intellect. He devoured books, taught himself practical arithmetic and bookkeeping, and worked in a trading house where ships, ledgers, and Caribbean politics passed constantly under his nose. The hurricane letter that later impressed local patrons with its fluent, almost literary despair did more than secure him passage north. It showed a pattern that would define his life. Whenever chaos threatened to swallow him, Hamilton reached for order, numbers, plans, systems, and tried to build a structure sturdy enough that no child like the one he had been would be left exposed to the same gusts of fate. 48. Hamilton's marriage to Eliza Schuyler. When Alexander Hamilton married Elizabeth Eliza Schuyler in 1780, he didn't just gain a wife, he entered one of New York's most powerful and well-connected families. The Schuylers were a web of land, militia commands, political influence, and marital alliances stretching across the Hudson Valley and deep into the colonial elite. General Philip Schuyler, Eliza's father, had war experience, legislative ties, and a Rolodex of relationships that could open doors Hamilton might otherwise have spent a lifetime knocking on. The match had real affection at its core. Surviving letters between Alexander and Eliza pulse with tenderness, private jokes, and shared anxieties, but it was also an unmistakable union of outsider talent with insider anchoring. For a man marked by early abandonment, the Schuyler household offered something he had never known, a sprawling, intergenerational family network in which he was not an afterthought but a favored son-in-law. That embrace didn't erase his insecurity. If anything, it heightened the stakes. Success and scandal now reflected not only on him, but on a clan whose name carried weight in legislatures and salons. Eliza herself, quieter in public than her husband, became a stabilizing counterpoint to his volatility, managing their home, bearing and raising children, enduring separations during war and politics, and later suffering through revelations of his infidelity and the ferocious public battles that defined his career. In private grief after his death, and in her long widowhood dedicated to preserving his papers and legacy, you can see the marriage's third strand, not just romance and ambition, but a fierce, deliberate effort by Eliza to stitch Hamilton's tumultuous life into a story future generations would remember, even if they never quite saw the private cost she paid to keep that memory alive. 49. Hamilton's intense writing habit. Hamilton's real superpower wasn't the sword or the stirring speech. It was the pen that almost never left his hand. From the moment he arrived in New York, he treated writing not as a chore but as a survival strategy, pouring out letters, essays, and reports at a pace that left even his contemporaries blinking. During the Revolution, he drafted Washington's correspondence so quickly and elegantly that foreign diplomats assumed they were reading the general's own thoughts, not those of a young aide-de-camp hunched over a candle. In the 1790s, the same habit turned into a political weapon. Federalist papers written overnight, Treasury reports that laid out entire financial systems in dry but devastating detail, private letters that stitched together coalitions and undercut rivals before they knew a fight had started. He wrote when he was angry, when he was anxious, when he felt cornered, flooding friends and foes with arguments, defenses, and warnings. To read his collected papers is to watch a man trying to outpace his own insecurity by sheer output, convinced that if he could just explain enough, clarify enough, document enough, he could bend events to his design. The private cost was exhaustion, his and everyone else's, but the public result was a paper trail so dense that Hamilton's voice still feels startlingly present, even in the quiet of 2 centuries' distance. 50. Hamilton's affair with Maria Reynolds. For all his obsession with order, Hamilton's personal life could veer straight into chaos, and nowhere more famously than with Maria Reynolds. In the summer of 1791, a distressed young woman appeared at his door in Philadelphia, telling a story of an abusive husband and asking for help. What followed, by Hamilton's own later account, was a sexual relationship that he pursued despite every possible warning light flashing. Her husband, James Reynolds, soon turned the situation into a low-grade extortion scheme, demanding money to keep quiet while subtly tightening the screws whenever he sensed Hamilton's fear of scandal. When political enemies later accused Hamilton of using Treasury funds for speculation, he made a choice that still startles historians. Rather than let the implication of corruption stand, he dragged the private mess into daylight. In a lengthy, almost compulsively detailed pamphlet, he admitted the affair, described the blackmail payments, and tried to wall off the sexual indiscretion from charges of financial misconduct. It was a defensive maneuver in which he sacrificed his own moral reputation, and by extension his family's privacy, to preserve the integrity of his public office. The Reynolds affair shows the odd calculus of a man who valued honor in accounts more than honor in bedrooms, and who believed that if he could just tell the whole sordid story himself, the truth would protect him better than silence ever could. 51. The Reynolds pamphlet's personal fallout. If Hamilton thought confession would contain the damage, he misjudged how far paper could travel and how slowly whispers died. The Reynolds pamphlet landed in 1797 like a slow-burning grenade, its explicit details and self-flagellating tone providing endless fodder for gossip, sermons, and political cartoons. Opponents seized on the affair as proof that the high-minded architect of public credit was privately just another man of appetites, prone to hypocrisy and poor judgment. Supporters winced, trying to reconcile the frankness of his financial defense with the recklessness of exposing his wife and children to such public humiliation. For Eliza, who had once watched her husband write the nation's financial system, the pamphlet meant seeing her marriage dissected by strangers who would never know the intimate texture of their life together. Their home became a place where printed words, not just private choices, had broken trust. Hamilton's own sense of honor remained oddly intact in his mind. He had, after all, proven he hadn't stolen from the treasury, but his social standing, especially among those who prized personal virtue as the foundation of Republican leadership, never fully recovered. Long before a Broadway musical turned the episode into a cultural touchstone, it had already done its work in real time, freezing a moment of personal failure into the permanent record, and reminding everyone watching that in the New Republic, character and credibility were currencies as fragile as paper money. 52. Hamilton and Eliza's grief over Philip. Hamilton had debated in print, dueled with words, and treated political life as a battlefield, but nothing in his carefully drawn plans prepared him for the silence that followed his son's last breath. In 1801, their eldest, Philip, barely 20, stepped onto a dueling ground in New York to defend his father's honor against insults from a lawyer named George Eaker. Following the so-called code of honor that Alexander himself verbally condemned yet never fully escaped, Philip agreed to the meeting, fired late, and was mortally wounded. The scene at his bedside pulled Hamilton out of the realm of public theory into the rawest kind of private loss. Accounts describe him kneeling, praying, and staying with his son through the agony of his final night. For Eliza, the blow landed even deeper. Philip had been her pride, a bright musical boy who shared his father's intellect and charm, and his death carved a permanent hollow in her life. The household turned inward. Letters from the period carry a weight that doesn't need exclamation points to be felt. Hamilton's later decision to accept Aaron Burr's challenge and to participate in another duel on almost the same ground reads differently when you remember that he had already buried one son there. Whether he believed he would throw away his shot or thought fate had already written his ending, the earlier tragedy with Philip haunted that final morning, a quiet ghost standing between the lines of every surviving account of Hamilton's last hours. 53. Hamilton's taste for luxury. For a man who wrote stoically about public frugality and national credit, Hamilton's private tastes leaned toward the polished and the finely made. From his early days in New York, he showed an eye for well-cut coats, quality fabrics, and the kind of grooming that signaled seriousness to a society still wired to equate appearance with character. Critics, especially Southern planters, wary of his financial schemes, muttered that he dressed above his station, an upstart orphan wearing the trappings of an aristocrat. Supporters saw something else, a man so determined to control how the world perceived him that he was willing to go into debt to maintain a certain standard of elegance. The Schuyler marriage brought some insulation. Eliza's family had the resources to soften the edges of his spending, but his letters and account books still show regular tension between income and outlay, between the moral virtue of restraint and the practical reality that influence in that era often arrived in the same room as polished boots and tailored jackets. Hamilton believed in the power of presentation, not just for individuals but for the nation. A strong credit rating, a functioning treasury, and a government that looked competent were, in his mind, all versions of the same lesson he had learned early. People trust what appears orderly, prosperous, and composed. His wardrobe and his debt were small, personal extensions of that larger creed. 54. Eliza Hamilton's long widowhood. When Aaron Burr's bullet ended Hamilton's life in 1804, Eliza entered a chapter that would last more than 50 years, long enough to see the world rearrange itself around a memory she stubbornly kept alive. Widowed in her late 40s, with several children still dependent on her and finances strained by years of public and private turbulence, she sold the family home in New York, moved to more modest quarters, and set about two parallel tasks: survival and curation. She co-founded an orphan asylum, channeling her own experience of loss into structured care for children who, like Alexander once had, started life without stable protection. At the same time, she guarded his papers, letters, and public writings with a tenacity that made visiting biographers both grateful and slightly wary. She corrected stories, refused to indulge in certain speculations, and steered early accounts toward an image of Hamilton that emphasized his principles over his scandals. Friends recalled that she burned some private correspondence, a choice that has sparked endless debate among historians, but made perfect sense for a woman trying to balance history's appetite with a widow's right to close certain doors. Living into the 1850s, Eliza watched new generations argue over the meaning of the founding era, always aware that the man they debated was not just a statesman on a page but the complicated, brilliant, wounded husband she had loved and forgiven. Her long widowhood became its own kind of political act, a sustained insistence that behind the public architect of American finance stood a private life worth remembering, even if only she fully knew its contours. 55. Benjamin Franklin's common law marriage. By the time Alexander Hamilton was cutting a dashing figure in New York, Benjamin Franklin had already spent decades in a relationship that didn't quite fit neatly into any legal category, a domestic arrangement that looked like marriage, felt like marriage, but was never fully anchored in the paperwork that made marriage respectable in the 18th century. Franklin and Deborah Red began as near neighbors in Philadelphia, flirted toward something more formal, and then stalled when he sailed off to London, and Deborah, abandoned and unable to secure a clean divorce from a husband who vanished, entered a strange limbo in which remarriage could technically make her a bigamist. When Franklin returned and they decided to live together, they stitched their life with practical vows rather than church or court decrees, pooling money, raising children, and running a household and printing business in a city where everyone knew what they were, but few bothered to ask whether the law did. Theirs was a common law marriage in the literal sense, common enough in practice, murky on parchment, and it exposed how often colonial society quietly prioritized stability and mutual usefulness over doctrinal purity. Franklin, with his fondness for compromise, seemed largely unbothered by the ambiguity. Deborah, who shouldered the risks if the arrangement were challenged, carried the more fragile side of that bargain, tied to a brilliant man whose fame depended on the very public respectability that their private situation complicated. 56. Franklin's illegitimate son William. Long before Franklin became the white-haired sage of revolution, he was a young tradesman with a private complication that would shadow his public life, a child whose mother's identity remains, even now, frustratingly unclear. William Franklin appeared in Benjamin's household in the early 1730s, folded into the family story with minimal explanation, acknowledged in letters but never accompanied by a candid account of his origins. The surviving evidence, scattered references, careful silences, suggests an affair, perhaps with a servant or a woman of lower social standing, someone whose name Franklin chose to protect or simply erase from the official version of himself. What's striking is not that he fathered a child out of wedlock, plenty of men in his era did, but that he refused to hide William in the shadows, raising him openly under his roof, training him in politics and diplomacy, and using his connections to secure his son a royal governorship in New Jersey. The illegitimacy, which could have been a permanent stain in a status-obsessed society, became instead an early test case of Franklin's ability to frame narrative. He acknowledged William without dwelling on the circumstances, invited the world to accept the son's prominence while quietly walling off the question of his mother. That missing figure hangs over the story like negative space in a painting, reminding us that even in the age of self-made men and self-written autobiographies, some lives, especially women's, were edited out before the ink dried. 57. Franklin's air baths. Among the many small experiments Franklin conducted on himself, one of the most charming, and by modern standards, a bit startling, involved a daily ritual he called his air bath, a practice that blended Enlightenment curiosity with a kind of casual exhibitionism. Convinced that fresh air was essential to health and that stuffy, Overheated rooms bred illness. He developed the habit of sitting naked or nearly naked in his chambers, with the windows flung open, letting cool air move over his skin while he read, wrote, or simply thought through the day's problems. To Franklin, this wasn't indecency, it was applied science, a way to test theories about perspiration, ventilation, and the body's ability to regulate itself, much as he had once flown a kite into a storm to draw lightning from the sky. Letters to friends describe the routine with disarming cheerfulness, as if the sight of a famous printer-statesman perched unclothed by the glass were no more remarkable than a morning cup of tea. In an era when most people feared drafts as agents of illness, his deliberate courting of moving air, even in winter, marked him as odd but also as someone willing to push against conventional wisdom in the most intimate spaces. The air baths didn't make him immortal, but they fit the pattern of a man who treated his own body and habits as a laboratory, convinced that comfort, cleanliness, and a bit of controlled discomfort could all be harnessed in the service of a longer, sharper life. 58. Franklin's pseudonymous flirtation writing. Before Franklin became known for grave pronouncements about liberty and virtue, he had already spent years playing an elaborate literary game with the reading public, slipping into borrowed identities to explore topics too delicate or too mischievous for his own name. As a teenage apprentice, he famously invented Mrs. Silence Dogood, a fictional middle-aged widow whose sly essays on manners, marriage, and social hypocrisy slipped into his brother's newspaper and fooled the town. Later, he multiplied his masks, writing as everything from a busybody gossip to a pompous gentleman, using humor to poke at how desire and decorum collided in everyday life. Some of these personas flirted on the page, offering arch commentary on courtship rituals, the expectations placed on women, and the often ridiculous behavior of men who fancied themselves irresistible. By adopting female voices, he could say things about male vanity and sexual double standards that would have sounded sharp or ungallant if issued under his own signature. By pretending to be prudish or overly proper, he could gently mock moral rigidity, while technically defending it. These pseudonymous essays were not secret confessions so much as carefully staged performances, a way for Franklin to test ideas about gender, power, and pleasure, without tying them directly to the rising public figure of Benjamin Franklin, printer and later politician. Reading them now, you can feel both the playfulness and the calculation, a young mind learning that sometimes the safest way to say a dangerous thing is to let a fictional voice carry the joke. 59. Franklin's advice on older mistresses. Tucked among Franklin's more sober letters about thrift, hard work, and public duty is a notorious piece of private advice that has given generations of biographers pause. An unblushing essay recommending that if a man insists on taking a mistress, he should choose an older woman. Written to a young acquaintance and never meant for public eyes, the letter lays out a list of pragmatic reasons with the same tidy logic Franklin might apply to an experiment or a budget. Older women, he argued, are more discreet, more grateful, less likely to become pregnant, and more motivated to be kind and attentive because society has already written them off as beyond the age of romance. The tone is half joking, half chilling in its matter-of-fact appraisal of women's social value as rising, and then sharply declining with youth, a calculus that places experience and secrecy above sentiment. For a long time, the document circulated in whispers and partial copies, its authenticity debated, its authorship alternately defended as satire or condemned as cynical lechery. Whether Franklin meant every word or was exaggerating for effect, the letter sits awkwardly beside his public image as a champion of virtue, revealing how elastic that word could be when filtered through private mail correspondence. It also underscores how 18th century conversations about sex and aging, usually hidden behind polite euphemisms, occasionally surfaced in stark, utilitarian language that makes the distance between then and now feel both vast and uncomfortably small. 60. Franklin's estrangement from Loyalist son William. If Franklin's early life with William showed how a father could fold an illegitimate child into his public ambitions, the Revolution demonstrated how quickly that bond could tear when politics turned from theory to blood. As tensions with Britain escalated, William, who had climbed into royal favor as governor of New Jersey, chose to remain loyal to the crown, arguing that order and gradual reform were safer than rebellion. Benjamin, moving steadily toward the patriot cause, watched with growing dismay as his son refused to break with the very system the elder Franklin had spent years criticizing in print. When war came, the divide hardened into something close to exile. William was arrested by American forces, held in grim conditions, and eventually released in a prisoner exchange that did little to heal the underlying wound. Father and son exchanged letters, met briefly after the war, and toyed with reconciliation. But Benjamin never fully forgave what he saw as a betrayal, not just of family, but of principle. While William resented the ease with which his father seemed to trade royal favor for revolutionary celebrity. In his will, Franklin left William relatively little, a pointed gesture that memorialized their estrangement in legal language as cold as any public proclamation he ever signed. The break between them offers a quieter, more intimate angle on a familiar story. Beyond the soaring rhetoric of independence lay households split down the middle, where loyalty meant choosing not just a side in a conflict, but which version of one's own father or son to live with, and which to lose. 61. Franklin's late life fame in France. By the time Franklin crossed the Atlantic as America's aging envoy, he stepped into Paris not as a modest printer turned politician, but as an almost mythic figure the French had been primed to adore, a living emblem of rustic wisdom and republican simplicity. Aristocrats and intellectuals, hungry for a fashionable philosophy of liberty that didn't yet threaten their own estates, projected their fantasies onto him, the homespun sage in a fur cap, the philosopher who tamed lightning and now might help tame kings. His face appeared everywhere, on medallions, snuff boxes, busts, and printed portraits, circulating through drawing rooms and shops the way celebrity posters float through our own world. Manufacturers stamped his profile on teapots and decorative plates. Ladies wore cameos bearing his image, treating him as a kind of Enlightenment good luck charm. What amused Franklin was how deliberately he leaned into the performance, understanding that the less he looked like a powdered courtier and the more he resembled a kindly, slightly shabby patriarch, the more symbolic power he wielded in salons. He accepted being turned into a consumer icon because it bought him something far more valuable than flattery, a reservoir of public affection that could be translated into loans, political leverage, and French enthusiasm for a distant, experimental republic. The private man from Philadelphia, who had once scraped for every coin, watched his likeness become a luxury commodity in a city that barely knew his language, proof that sometimes the surest way to move governments is to become irresistible to their fashion-obsessed subjects first. 62. Deborah read Franklin's fear of sea travel. Behind Franklin's glittering Parisian fame sat an absence that visitors noticed only when they asked why the great man's wife never joined him. Deborah Reed, who remained in Philadelphia her entire life, bound there not only by household responsibilities and fragile health, but by a deep, unshakable dread of the ocean that hardened into refusal whenever the idea of crossing it arose. From early in their marriage, she had lived through his departures with a kind of silent terror, watching him disappear downriver toward ships that might be wrecked by storms, pirates, disease, or simply the incompetence of captains on a dangerous Atlantic. Each time he pushed for her to accompany him on long diplomatic assignments, she balked, citing her fear of sea travel as firmly as others might invoke religious vows. To friends and family, it became a known fact, almost a quirk of character, but for her it was a wall that kept her world small and his immeasurably wide. The distance shaped their marriage into something seasonal and epistolary, punctuated by long stretches in which she managed the printing business, raised children, and guarded the household alone while he charmed London or Paris. Historians disagree on how much of her refusal was pure fear, and how much was a practical calculation that a woman who'd once been trapped legally by a vanished husband was wary of leaving her remaining security behind. But whatever the mix, the result was that Franklin's international life unfolded without the partner who had weathered his early leaner years. When she died in 1774, while he was again abroad, the Atlantic she had so dreaded had already separated them for nearly a decade, turning her phobia into a quiet force that reshaped not just their private companionship, but the emotional geography of Franklin's entire public career. 63. John Hancock's fashionable wardrobe. If Franklin traded on carefully cultivated plainness, John Hancock did almost the opposite, stepping into the revolutionary spotlight dressed like a man who fully expected the world to watch him. Orphaned young but adopted into a wealthy merchant household, he inherited not just ships and warehouses but a taste for display that ran straight through his closets, embroidered coats in vivid colors, waistcoats of shimmering silk, lace ruffles at his wrists, and enough elegant walking sticks, rings, and buckles to outfit a small playhouse troupe. In Boston streets, where plain wool and homespun linen signaled virtue to many patriots, Hancock often appeared in clothes that looked closer to those of the aristocrats he would soon denounce, a contradiction that made him a lightning rod for both admiration and suspicion. British observers sneered at his extravagance, while some fellow colonists muttered that no true friend of Republican simplicity needed such gleaming shoe buckles, yet crowds flocked to see him precisely because he cut such a dramatic figure, a kind of homegrown nobleman who dared to use the visual language of status against the empire that had invented it. His famously oversized, flourishing signature on the Declaration of Independence feels of a piece with this wardrobe, a flourish meant to be seen from a distance, a statement that style and defiance could coexist. Hancock's clothes, like his carriages and carefully staged public entrances, weren't mere vanity. They were tools in a political theater where appearance could telegraph confidence, success, and the idea that the patriot cause was not a movement of ragged grumblers, but of men so sure of their authority that they dressed as if they already ran a nation. 64. Hancock and Dorothy Quincy's courtship. Before Hancock became the man whose name stood out on charters and currency, he spent years negotiating a more delicate contract, his on-again, off-again relationship with Dorothy Quincy, a sharp-witted member of one of Massachusetts' prominent families whose life intersected with his just as politics in Boston turned explosive. Their courtship threaded through tea tables and parlor visits, but also through town meetings, boycotts, and the growing sense that any union between elites now carried not just social consequences but political symbolism. Dorothy, accustomed to refinement and conversation, watched as her suitor moved from merchant prince to wanted rebel. She was present at Lexington in April 1775, staying at a relative's house when shots were fired, and the legend has her insisting she would not flee the danger, simply because men were fighting nearby. Their marriage, when it finally happened, had to be fitted around war councils and Hancock's frequent absences, his public role pulling him to Philadelphia and beyond, while she navigated households that might at any moment become targets or refuges. Social expectations hovered over her every move. She was expected to embody both the grace of a governor's lady and the frugality of a patriot's wife, at a time when showing too much luxury could draw criticism and showing too much sacrifice could look like performative piety. Letters and fragments suggest a partnership in which Hancock's vanity and bouts of ill health were tempered by Dorothy's steadier temperament and occasional flashes of impatience with hero worship. Their story reminds us that revolutionary romance was rarely a simple tale of hearts and flowers. It unfolded in rooms where news of battles arrived between dances, where engagements could be delayed by troop movements, and where a woman like Dorothy had to calculate, every day, how to support a husband who belonged as much to the public as he did to her. 65. Hancock's gout and pain. Behind the glittering clothes and sweeping gestures that made Hancock such a visible symbol of the patriot cause lurked a very unglamorous reality. Chronic gout that attacked his joints, especially in his feet, with waves of agony that could leave him immobilized for days. In an age before effective pain management, gout carried its own social script, caricatured in prints as the curse of wealthy men who enjoyed too much rich food and wine, and Hancock, with his comfortable lifestyle, fit the stereotype a little too neatly for some critics' liking. But the reality was less comic than the cartoons. There were stretches where he conducted affairs of state from a chair or bed, leg propped up, writing with one hand while the other clutched the armrest when a sudden stab of pain shot through him. The illness shaped his movements and choices more than public rhetoric ever admitted. Long journeys could be torture. Public appearances required advanced calculation about how far he could walk, and episodes of swelling and inflammation forced temporary withdrawals from political battles he was otherwise eager to fight. His inability at times to ride or stand for long ceremonies made him dependent on helpers, carriages, and carefully arranged seating that preserved the illusion of unbroken vigor. Gout also threaded into his self-image, a constant reminder that the body carrying his famous name was vulnerable and finite, even as crowds treated him like a symbol. Some contemporaries whispered that his ailments made him moody or erratic. Others noted a growing patience in him, as if chronic pain had sanded down some of his earlier impulsiveness. However interpreted, the disease stitched itself into the daily logistics of his leadership, proof that even the boldest signatures on founding documents were written by hands attached to joints that throbbed, swelled, and sometimes refused to cooperate at all. 66. Hancock's lavish entertaining. If Hancock's wardrobe and carriages announced his status on the street, His dining table and drawing rooms did the same work in private, turning hospitality into a kind of soft power machine that fed the revolutionary cause, one carefully orchestrated evening at a time. In a town where many patriots preached virtue through restraint, he poured money into dinners with multiple courses, imported wines, and carefully curated guest lists that mixed merchants, ministers, visiting dignitaries, and sometimes the very people he needed to sway on committees or in elections. Critics grumbled that such extravagance flirted with aristocratic decadence, but Hancock understood that humans have always been more persuadable after good food and flattery. A man who left his house well-fed, complimented, and feeling part of an inner circle was more likely to support his host's next motion on the floor. These events were not mindless parties so much as stages upon which alliances were rehearsed and renewed, with toasts doubling as subtle policy signals and seating charts mapping out who needed mending or encouragement. His conspicuous generosity, paying debts for struggling neighbors, donating to public causes with visible flourish, opening his home for civic occasions, reinforced a narrative that his wealth existed not just for personal comfort but for communal benefit, even if the line between the two could get blurry. During and after the Revolution, as inflation, war costs, and his own spending threatened his finances, the same lavishness that built his influence also strained his accounts, a reminder that political theater carries real bills. Still, in a culture where suspicion of ostentation ran high, Hancock managed to weaponize splendor, using dinners, balls, and public feasts not merely to indulge his taste, but to knit together a coalition around a new and precarious idea that men who had once bowed to a distant king could be enticed, over good claret and roast, into imagining themselves the architects of their own republic. 67. Samuel Adams's brewing background. Samuel Adams's image as a jovial brewer owes more to modern branding than to his actual muddled career in the malt trade, where he inherited connections to barley and malt, but never quite translated them into the kind of disciplined, profitable brewing operation that would justify picturing him as a full-time craftsman presiding over copper kettles. His father had been involved in malting, and young Samuel technically followed in that path, but even contemporaries noticed that his real passion tilted toward pamphlets and town meetings rather than ledgers and barrels. Boston knew him less as a meticulous producer than as a man perpetually short of cash and long on arguments about rights and constitutions. He moved in and out of roles that touched the brewing world, owning malt, supplying brewers, sometimes dabbling in the business end, but his true ferment bubbled in politics, not vats. The later choice to put his name on a beer brand blurred this old reality into something more marketable, baking the rebellious patriot and the hardy brewer into one cozy myth. What you rarely see in that myth is the quieter truth. Samuel Adams was far better at stirring public opinion than at keeping any commercial enterprise, including brewing, consistently afloat. 68. Samuel Adams's financial disorganization. Behind the firebrand who helped ignite revolution in Boston was a man who by most accounts could barely keep his personal finances in order, a paradox that amused and alarmed his contemporaries. Adams came from a family that knew money and property, but he seemed constitutionally unsuited to the steady attention accounts required. He let taxes pile up, neglected paperwork, and blurred the line between what belonged to him and what belonged to various committees or causes. At one point, his unpaid tax bills became a local talking point, with critics trying to weaponize his disarray as proof that he was irresponsible, even unfit for office, while allies scrambled to protect him from legal embarrassment. The same intensity that allowed him to spend endless hours in town meetings, drafting resolutions and nudging mobs toward targeted protests, left little energy for balancing books or following up on debts owed. Friends and relatives occasionally stepped in to cover shortfalls or quietly arranged terms with impatient creditors, treating his absent-mindedness almost like a chronic ailment. Yet the community tolerated and even indulged these habits because his political effectiveness was so high. He could marshal boycotts, coordinate committees of correspondence, and outmaneuver royal officials even if he couldn't keep a clean ledger. In a city where thrift and order were moral virtues, Adams's messy finances offered a reminder that the architects of independence were not all models of Puritan discipline. Some were men who let their personal accounts drift into chaos while meticulously organizing the resistance that would overturn an empire. 69. Samuel Adams's second marriage. Samuel Adams's public fierceness often overshadows how central domestic companionship was to the man behind the slogans, especially after the death of his first wife, Elizabeth Checkley, left him a widower with children and a house that felt abruptly hollow. For several years he moved through a life divided between political meetings and a home marked by quiet absence. His energies pulled ever more into the streets and assembly halls where he could lose himself in disputes over taxes and charters. When he married Elizabeth Wells, known as Betsy, in 1764, it was not a youthful romance but a late stabilizing alliance that gave him a partner willing to manage the daily realities his temperament often ignored. She brought steadiness to a household where money was perpetually tight, guests could appear at odd hours, and her husband's name was increasingly spoken with either reverence or fury around Boston. While he schemed over committees and correspondence, she anchored the home that gave him a place to retreat, however briefly, from the pressure of becoming the Revolution's tireless agitator. The marriage appears to have been affectionate in a quiet, practical way, with Betsy accepting that her husband's first loyalty, at least in the public eye, was to a cause rather than a family ledger. Their domestic life never approached the wealth or splendor of men like Hancock. Instead, it offered a kind of modest refuge, a kitchen and parlor where the man accused of orchestrating mobs could simply be a husband eating a meal. In that second marriage, Adams found not luxury but a renewed sense of order, the kind that allowed him to keep pushing Britain without entirely losing the fragile normalcy of a shared table and a trusted confidant. 70. Patrick Henry's mesmerizing silence at home. Patrick Henry entered American legend as the voice that could electrify a room with a single phrase, but the man his family knew was often surprisingly quiet, almost withdrawn, once the courtroom or assembly doors closed behind him. Witnesses to his great speeches remembered an orator who seemed to ignite from within, eyes blazing, gestures rising and falling in perfect rhythm with his arguments. Yet relatives reported evenings where he would sit for long stretches in near silence, lost in thought, or simply listening. This contrast puzzled some contemporaries who expected constant fireworks. Instead, they found a father and husband who conserved his energy, speaking plainly or not at all, content to let others chatter around him. In the domestic spaces of his plantations, the commanding performer yielded to a more introspective presence, wandering the grounds, reading or tinkering with small tasks while children and visitors filled the air with noise. Silence, for Henry, may have been both recovery and preparation, the low tide that made those dramatic public high tides possible. His quiet at home also shielded his inner life, the doubts, calculations, and private griefs that never surfaced in his ringing defenses of liberty could sink into those unspoken hours. To a nation that remembers only the thunder of "Give me liberty" or "Give me death," the idea of Patrick Henry as a man who sometimes preferred to let the fire go out by the hearth rather than in his voice adds a softer, more human layer to the legend. 71. Patrick Henry's large family. If Patrick Henry seemed subdued at home, part of it may have been sheer exhaustion from the realities of a household that grew into a small village under his roof, the product of 2 marriages and a remarkable number of children. He and his first wife, Sarah Shelton, had a brood that expanded steadily, babies born between court cases and legislative sessions, each new arrival adding another layer of noise, need, and logistical challenge to a life already crowded with legal work and political ambition. After Sarah's death, Henry remarried Dorothea Dandridge, decades younger, and the pattern resumed, more children, more cradles, more cries echoing through plantation rooms that were never truly quiet. Managing such a family required a web of enslaved labor, relatives, and overseers, a structure that made his domestic scale possible but rested on a system of bondage he publicly critiqued only selectively. The sheer number of dependents shaped his choices. He needed income from his law practice and land, and that pressure sometimes tugged against his willingness to devote time to revolutionary meetings or far-flung political duties. Visitors described scenes of chaotic warmth, children darting in and out while Henry sat, half listener, half absent-minded patriarch, suggesting a private world very different from the controlled staging of a courtroom. The scale of his family also meant that his legacy dispersed not just through speeches preserved in history books, but through dozens of descendants carrying fragments of his temperament, his stories, and his complicated place in a world that preached liberty while running on inherited labor and land. 72. Patrick Henry's first wife, Sarah Shelton's illness. Beneath the booming rhetoric of Patrick Henry's public life lay a domestic heartbreak that rarely surfaces in patriotic narratives. the long, devastating mental illness of his first wife, Sarah Shelton, which turned their home into a quiet ward and forced him into agonizing choices. In an era with no real psychiatric care and grim options for those deemed deranged, Sarah's deterioration left Henry balancing his love for her against a society that urged confinement, sometimes in harsh, prison-like asylums. Accounts suggest that rather than sending her away, he arranged for her to be kept in a specially secured room on their property, guarded and tended, allowing her to remain physically close even as her mind retreated into realms no one around her could reach. This decision meant that daily life for the family unfolded in the shadow of muffled cries, sudden episodes, and the constant worry of what she might do if restraints failed, all while visitors and neighbors observed the carefully controlled surface of plantation hospitality. Henry continued his legal and political work, riding off to argue cases and denounce tyranny, then returning to a house where his own wife lived in a kind of private captivity, not from malice, but from the crude limits of 18th century medicine. Her illness and eventual death cast a long emotional shadow over him, one that may have deepened the sense of human frailty and injustice that colored his most passionate speeches. It is easier to remember him as the man who shouted for liberty, harder, but perhaps more honest, to picture him standing outside a locked door, listening for the movements of a woman he loved but could no longer truly reach. 73. Richard Henry Lee's family networks. Richard Henry Lee did not move through Virginia politics as a solitary genius. He swam in a dense sea of cousins, in-laws, and old surnames that opened doors before he ever spoke. The Lees, Carters, Randolphs, and related clans intermarried so thoroughly that a dinner invitation could double as a strategy session, with uncles, brothers-in-law, and distant relations quietly aligning county offices, militia commissions, and legislative votes. When Lee pushed bold measures like the Resolution for Independence in 1776, he did so from within a lattice of kin who could whisper in parish vestries and courthouse yards on his behalf. Favors flowed along these family lines, a recommendation here, a land deal there, a son placed in a clerkship or an advantageous marriage, all reinforcing the authority of a few interconnected houses. To outsiders, this elite web looked like merit rising naturally. Inside, everyone understood that a familiar last name and a shared grandmother mattered as much as talent or ideas. Lee's letters show him constantly tending this network, sending polite notes, condolences, and congratulations that doubled as reminders of mutual obligation. His political world was less a battlefield of individuals and more a family business scaled up to govern a colony, with loyalty owed as much to blood and marriage as to abstract Republican virtue. 74. John Jay's devotional domesticity. In John Jay's household, the private rhythms of life turned around prayer, scripture, and a sense that every ordinary act carried moral weight. He began and ended days with religious reading, wove biblical language into letters, and treated family decisions, from child-rearing to household spending, as matters of conscience rather than convenience. Friends might relax into gossip after dinner. Jay steered conversation toward duty, justice, and the state of one's soul, giving even small gatherings a slightly sermon-like tone. His version of rest was often meditation or religious study, which could make his home feel grave to visitors expecting lighter diversions. Discipline was not just for public office. He applied it to sleep, diet, and daily routines, building a domestic order that mirrored his ideal of a well-regulated republic. This devout atmosphere shaped his children, who grew up under the constant expectation that they would match piety with usefulness. Even in periods of intense public responsibility as Chief Justice, diplomat, or governor, Jay treated family worship and moral instruction as duties equal to drafting treaties or opinions. To live in his private world was to inhabit a quiet, carefully tended garden of religious habit, where spiritual housekeeping mattered as much as sweeping the floors. 75. John Jay and Sarah Livingston's marriage. John Jay's marriage to Sarah Livingston was not just a romance. It was a careful joining of two powerful New York dynasties that also turned out to be genuinely affectionate. The Jays brought legal training, Huguenot discipline, and rising political clout. The Livingstons contributed vast connections, land, and a reputation for reform-minded leadership along the Hudson. Their union helped knit together factions in a colony where family rivalries could easily spill into politics, giving Jay broader credibility among merchants, landholders, and reformers. Yet their surviving letters read less like cold alliance and more like a long conversation between two people who trusted each other's judgment and missed each other's company. When Jay traveled on diplomatic missions, Sarah managed estates, finances, and social obligations back home, effectively serving as his domestic counterpart and political ally. He consulted her on household and even public matters, respecting her intelligence in a way that quietly challenged assumptions about women's purely ornamental roles. Friends noticed the warmth between them, an ease that made their often formal surroundings feel less staged. In a circle where marriages were frequently transactional, the Jays managed something rarer, a partnership that was both strategically useful and sincerely tender. 76. Gouverneur Morris's wooden leg. Gouverneur Morris moved through salons and assemblies on a wooden leg that might have humbled another man but became part of his legend. The injury, from a violent carriage accident in 1780, cost him a limb but not his appetite for company, flirtation, or politics. He adapted quickly, ordering an artificial leg and learning to navigate stairs, dance floors, and parliamentary halls with a jaunty resilience that spectators could not ignore. Rather than hiding the disability, he folded it into his persona, joking about it, turning potential awkwardness into a display of confidence and wit. His sharp tongue and expressive face drew attention upward, away from the missing limb, allowing him to control how people saw him. In an era that often equated physical wholeness with authority, Morris proved that charisma and intelligence could rewrite those expectations. The wooden leg also became a kind of unspoken symbol, a reminder that the men drafting constitutions had bodies battered by accidents, illness, and war. Behind every polished speech he delivered stood the daily literal balancing act of a man who refused to let a shattered leg shrink his world. 77. Gouverneur Morris's romantic reputation. Where some founders nurse reputations for stern virtue, Gouverneur Morris deliberately cultivated the air of a worldly, charming rogue, and his private writings suggest he earned it. In New York and Philadelphia, he traded quips, compliments, and glances with practiced ease, building an image as the witty bachelor who could enliven any dinner table. His time in Europe, especially in pre-revolutionary and revolutionary Paris, added another layer. He moved among salons, courtiers, and exiles with an ease that extended from politics to romance. His diary entries, written with a startling frankness for the period, hint at affairs, entanglements, and emotional negotiations that were anything but simple. He balanced flirtations with married women, discreet liaisons, and moments of genuine attachment, all the while maintaining a public face of composure. Friends sometimes shook their heads at his escapades, seeing potential scandal. Morris seemed to accept the risk as part of his temperament. This active, complicated romantic life fits uneasily with later textbook portraits of dispassionate founders, reminding us that one of the Constitution's sharpest stylists was also a man very much alive to bodily and emotional desires. 78. Morris's Paris Diary candor. Morris's Paris diaries pull back the curtain on elite society with a level of detail that feels almost indecent for the 1790s. He recorded conversations, flirtations, and financial schemes with the same cool precision, noting who betrayed whom at court, who was sleeping with whom, and how each intrigue intersected with larger political currents. Aristocrats and revolutionaries passed through his pages not as marble busts, but as vain, frightened, witty, or foolish individuals, their grandeur undercut by petty jealousies and private miseries. He did not spare himself. His own motives, missteps, and desires appear with a disarming self-awareness that makes him both narrator and specimen. There is gossip, but it is analytic gossip, tying bedroom secrets and salon quarrels to debates over constitutions, war, and money. For a man helping shape American financial and political systems, this habit of observation turned daily life into raw data about human nature under stress. Reading those entries today feels like eavesdropping on a founder whispering that power is always entangled with appetite, fear, and vanity, and that he knew he was part of that web, not outside it. 79. Aaron Burr's secretive personal style. Aaron Burr learned early that showing less meant losing less, so he turned reserve into armor, masking his calculations behind an almost eerily calm politeness. He listened more than he talked, waited out awkward silences, and let other men over-explain their positions while he gave away almost nothing. In an age of speechifying, he could sit through a whole dinner and leave people realizing, hours later, that they had no idea what he truly thought. Friends called it self-command, enemies called it coldness or duplicity, and both were partly right. That guardedness let him slide between factions without tying himself too openly to any camp, which was useful in New York's cutthroat politics, but devastating to his reputation after the duel with Hamilton. Once people wanted to see villainy, the old quietness suddenly looked like proof of hidden schemes. Burr rarely defended himself in public, reinforcing the mystery. His refusal to spill feelings or explanations left a vacuum that gossip, and later historians eagerly filled, turning a private habit of emotional caution into the raw material for a lifetime of suspicion. 80. Burr and Theodosia Prevost's marriage. Long before the Hamilton duel, Burr shocked polite society in a quieter way by falling hard for Theodosia Prevost, an older married woman with children and a sharp, questioning mind. She moved in cosmopolitan circles, shaped by French Enlightenment writers, skeptics, and officers who talked about politics and philosophy at the dinner table instead of just crops and neighbors. After her first husband died, Burr married her, accepting not only her age and widowhood, but also her established, intellectually charged social world. In their letters, he treated her less like a decorative wife and more like a confidant, quoting Voltaire, debating religion, and asking her opinion on legal and political problems. Her house became a kind of informal salon, where officers, lawyers, and thinkers crossed paths, expanding Burr's contacts well beyond the usual New York legal crowd. This partnership helped shape his taste for bold, sometimes heterodox ideas, including a more relaxed view of religion and a skepticism of moral posturing. To many contemporaries, the match looked odd. To Burr, it offered the rare combination of desire, companionship, and strategic advantage. The marriage anchored him emotionally, and when she died, friends noticed that some of his remaining restraint and steadiness seemed to die with her. 81. Aaron Burr's devotion to daughter Theodosia. When his daughter Theodosia was born, Burr quietly decided to raise her the way most elite fathers reserved only for sons. He hired first-rate tutors, drilled her in Latin, history, and philosophy, and sent her reading lists that could intimidate a law student. In letters, he quizzed her on Plutarch, asked her to analyze characters, and insisted she learn to argue clearly, not just embroider and play music. He praised her intellect openly, telling friends that women's supposed inferiority came from lack of education, not nature, an opinion considered radical enough to make people uncomfortable. Their correspondence reads like a mixture of parental tenderness and rigorous seminar, with jokes, endearments, and strict reminders about discipline and study habits. He expected her to move confidently in adult conversation, to host, to write well, to think politically, and she largely did. In the private sphere of his household, Burr quietly ran an experiment. What happens if you take a girl as seriously as any heir? The tragedy of her later disappearance at sea only deepened the legend of this intense bond, turning private syllables of affection and ambition into one of the most haunting personal stories attached to his name. 82. Burr's reputation for affairs. Aaron Burr's contemporaries did not need Broadway songs to whisper about his love life. The rumors circulated in real time. Handsome, witty, and attentive, he gave women the same undivided focus he brought to cross-examination, making many feel uniquely seen in a world that usually treated them as background furniture. Surviving letters, some coded and some startlingly direct, show him juggling flirtations, emotional entanglements, and at least a few affairs that went beyond innocent conversation. Admirers saw charm, critics saw predation, and later biographers had no trouble painting him as a libertine. Unlike Jefferson, who wrapped his private life in layers of silence, Burr often moved through social spaces where flirtation was half the currency, and he rarely pretended otherwise. That history made it easier, after the duel and the treason trial, to cast him as a man without firm moral anchor, a seducer in politics as well as in bedrooms. Yet some of the same traits that fed his reputation, emotional intensity, attentiveness, a willingness to ignore conventional boundaries, also underpinned his most loyal relationships. His magnetic, controversial image grew from a private life where romantic risk was a habit, not an exception. 83. Charles Carroll of Carrollton's Catholic household. Charles Carroll grew up in a Maryland world where being Catholic meant living with quiet constraints even while sitting atop immense wealth. Anti-Catholic laws limited public office and openly questioned the loyalty of people who followed Rome instead of the local Anglican establishment. Inside his household, however, Catholicism shaped everything: daily prayers, feast days, private chapels, and a sense of being a minority watched by skeptical neighbors. Carroll's family cultivated a polished, almost diplomatic style of piety, devout but cautious, avoiding needless provocation while refusing to disappear. He learned to talk about liberty, rights, and republicanism in terms that reassured nervous Protestants that his faith would not override his civic duty. Hosting Protestant allies at dinners where the household still moved to Catholic rhythms required constant social balancing. Children learned that their religion was both a source of identity and a potential liability, something to be cherished, but also carefully managed in public conversation. This double life, openly patriotic, quietly Catholic, gave Carroll a particular sensitivity to questions of minority rights and toleration. Yet he rarely framed his politics as special pleading. Instead, he tried to embody the idea that a Catholic gentleman could be as trustworthy an American as any Anglican neighbor. 84. Charles Carroll's plantation wealth. Behind Carroll's elegant letters about liberty and tyranny lay thousands of acres in Maryland, worked by people who had no liberty at all. As one of the richest men in the colonies, his fortune flowed from plantations, rents, and enslaved labor, a private reality that sat uneasily beside his public role as a champion of independence. His estates operated like small, tightly controlled worlds with overseers, ledgers, punishments, and routines that turned human lives into columns of profit and loss. Carroll worried over crop yields and markets, but the system's basic premise, that he could own people as property, went largely unquestioned in his correspondence for most of his life. Catholic piety and plantation discipline coexisted on the same ground. Sunday Mass might be followed on Monday by decisions about buying, selling, or punishing enslaved workers. When he signed the Declaration, risking his fortune against British retaliation, he did not risk the underlying social order that kept that fortune intact. Late in life, he occasionally voiced more abstract unease about slavery's future, but he never became a leading voice for emancipation. His private life shows how a man could sincerely fight imperial domination while remaining deeply invested in domination at home. 85. George Mason's domestic reserve. George Mason liked influence more than applause, which made his big brick house at Gunston Hall far more appealing than the echoing halls of distant legislatures. He dodged long trips whenever he could, pleading health, family business, or sheer fatigue with politics, and then happily buried himself in estate papers and river views. Guests found a man who could argue constitutional theory in the morning and then vanished to walk his fields in the afternoon, leaving letters unanswered for weeks. His neighbors knew that if you wanted Mason's brain, you usually had to come to him. He rarely chased the spotlight. The Virginia ratifying convention dragged him out of this domestic orbit, and afterward he recoiled, increasingly bitter about what he saw as the new federal government's overreach. Rather than spend years in Congress fighting compromises he distrusted, he retreated, choosing the predictable rhythms of plantation life over the bruising uncertainty of national politics. In a founding generation crowded with men who inhaled public attention, Mason's instinct was to treat public service as a temporary duty, not a permanent identity. 86. George Mason's many children. Inside Gunston Hall, politics was just one thread in a much denser tapestry of births, illnesses, tutors, and household crises. George Mason and his wife Anne Ailbeck Mason built a sprawling family, with children underfoot almost constantly, their noise and needs shaping his days more than speeches or newspapers did. Letters show him fretting over schooling, arranging apprenticeships, admonishing sons about behavior, and worrying about daughters' marriages with the same intensity he brought to drafting the Virginia Declaration of Rights. The family table doubled as classroom and strategy room, where older children absorbed their father's ideas about rights, debts, and British overreach almost by osmosis. Death was an uninvited but familiar guest. Some children did not survive, and the losses left private scars that rarely appear in public documents. Anne's death struck especially hard, turning the bustling household into a place of grief and adjustment. with Mason suddenly balancing political correspondence against the practical work of single parenthood. For him, the abstract talk of posterity had literal faces: sons he hoped would inherit land and integrity, daughters he wanted shielded yet respected. The sheer scale of his family made his political choices feel less like personal ambition and more like guardianship. 87. Roger Sherman's humble household economy. Roger Sherman never quite shed the habits of the cobbler and shopkeeper he once was, even after his signature landed on foundational documents. While other founders built grand country houses, Sherman kept his domestic life closer to a tidy New England ledger than a Manners expense book. He watched household costs, reused items, and treated unnecessary luxury as both moral danger and financial foolishness. Visitors noticed the plainness: simple meals, modest furnishings, a house that felt more like a hard-working tradesman's upgraded dwelling than a politician's showpiece. His wife and daughters managed chores with a frugality that matched his own, stretching resources carefully instead of displaying wealth. This home economy mirrored his public persona: methodical, cautious, always wary of debts that could trap families or governments. Where Virginia planters entertained with elaborate feasts financed partly on credit, Sherman preferred solvency and simplicity, even if it looked unimpressive. That domestic restraint gave him a certain moral authority when he warned against speculative schemes and overextended public spending. His household became a quiet demonstration that Republican virtue could live comfortably in a small, well-kept, decidedly unaristocratic space. 88. Elbridge Gerry's late marriage. Elbridge Gerry spent much of his early political life as a determined bachelor, arranging his days around committees, letters, and late-night debates. That pattern broke when he married Anne Thompson in his 40s, a match that suddenly rewired his routines and priorities. Instead of drifting from lodging house to legislative chamber, he now moved between a family home and the state house, carrying private obligations alongside public ones. Anne was significantly younger, lively, and socially adept, turning their household into a gathering spot where politics and domesticity mixed over tea and conversation. The marriage pulled him out of the floating, male-dominated world of boarding houses and into a more anchored domestic orbit, complete with pregnancies, children's illnesses, and the small negotiations that shape married life. Friends saw him soften in some ways, more attuned to how laws and unrest might touch families like his own. Yet the timing also meant he entered fatherhood and deeper emotional commitments just as national conflicts intensified, leaving him straddling late-blooming domestic happiness and rising public storms. His once solitary political existence now had a direct audience at home, listening for knocks at the door and news from the street. 89. Gerry's anxiety about popular unrest. Beneath Elbridge Gerry's formal manners ran a chronic, almost physical unease about crowds, mobs, and what they might do when anger tipped into action. Shays' rebellion in Massachusetts rattled him deeply. The image of armed farmers surrounding courthouses haunted his correspondence and his imagination. At home, that fear translated into a heightened sense of vulnerability, worry about his wife, about children, about whether government buildings and private houses could really keep violence out. He saw popular unrest, not just as a political problem, but as a potential invasion of the intimate spaces he cared about. That anxiety helped explain his suspicion of pure democracy and his support for checks, balances, and controls that might slow sudden surges of public passion. It also colored how he read noises in the night, or rumors from taverns, turning whispers into possible threats. When later protests and partisan clubs emerged, Gerry's reflex was defensive: protect institutions, shield families, assume the worst of volatile crowds. His private dread of disorder fused with his public stance, making him a founding father who looked at the people and saw both citizens and a possible storm. 90. Robert Morris's high-risk lifestyle. Robert Morris lived like a man convinced that fortune favored boldness, and for a while it did. As the Revolution's chief financier, he juggled credit, speculation, and government IOUs with a daring that seeped into his private life. He built or acquired grand houses, filled them with fine furniture, silver, and wine cellars that testified to both taste and confidence. Dinner at the Morris household meant rich food, powerful connections, and a sense that money, like politics, was a game to be played aggressively. His wife and children enjoyed the trappings of a merchant prince, assuming, as he seemed to, that his networks and instincts would keep the river of credit flowing. But high leverage cuts both ways. Land schemes and speculative ventures began to sag under their own weight, and the same risk-taking that had once saved the revolution started to sink his personal finances. Creditors closed in, assets evaporated, and the man who had moved millions ended up in debtor's prison, his family adjusting abruptly from opulence to constraint. His story shows how a founding-era appetite for speculation could turn a beautiful house into a fragile facade, hiding ledgers that were already bleeding red. 91. Robert Morris's mansion ambitions. At the height of his confidence, Robert Morris commissioned a Philadelphia mansion so huge it was nicknamed Morris's Folly before it was even finished. Designed by Pierre Charles L'Enfant, it was supposed to be an urban palace, a private stage for a man who thought he'd permanently joined the new nation's aristocracy of wealth. Room after room was planned for entertaining, impressing, and reminding guests that the revolution's financier had arrived at the pinnacle. But his finances were already wobbling, and the building costs only deepened the cracks. Work stalled, creditors pressed, and the enormous shell loomed over the city as a physical metaphor for overreach. He never lived there. The project collapsed along with his fortune, and the unfinished structure passed into other hands. In a young republic that liked to preach simplicity, Morris's abandoned mansion became a quiet cautionary tale about private extravagance built on unstable speculation. 92. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney's Rice Plantation World. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney's private life unfolded on low-country rice plantations, where title gates and enslaved labor turned swamps into money. His days mixed law, politics, and estate supervision, but the foundation of his comfort was the brutal efficiency of the rice fields. He moved in a tight circle of elite South Carolina families, bound by intermarriage, shared investments, and a worldview shaped by Atlantic commerce. European education and polished manners sat atop a home economy deeply integrated into slave markets and overseas trade. Letters from his plantations discuss crops, mills, and the health of enslaved workers with the cool tone of business reports. He could debate Republican virtue in Philadelphia and then return to a household that depended on a rigid social hierarchy. Pinckney's world illustrates how the founding generation's high politics were often financed by muddy fields far from the convention halls. 93. John Rutledge's family tragedies. John Rutledge's public career from governor to Supreme Court nominee ran parallel to a private life increasingly shadowed by loss. The death of his wife Elizabeth struck hard, pulling away the emotional anchor around which his household had revolved. Grief mixed with mounting financial pressures and political frustrations, turning the polished Charleston lawyer into a man wrestling visible strain. By the 1790s, reports circulated of erratic behavior and deep melancholy, feeding opponents' arguments that he was unfit for high judicial office. His impassioned, gloomy speech against the Jay Treaty, delivered while already fragile, became a lightning rod for criticism. The Senate's rejection of his nomination to be Chief Justice was as much about perceived instability as about policy. Behind the formal language of unsuitability lay a story of a widower whose personal sorrows and mental burdens bled into his public reputation. In an age with little understanding of mental health, Rutledge's downward spiral was read as weakness, not suffering. 94. Fisher Ames's frail health. Fisher Ames spent his career writing scorching speeches and letters from a body that rarely cooperated for long. Chronic illness, digestive troubles, headaches, persistent weakness forced him into careful routines of rest, mild diet, and frequent withdrawal from bustling Boston life. He often composed his most striking reflections at home, propped by pillows, turning physical limitation into an engine for contemplation. While other politicians traveled widely to rally supporters, Ames relied on pen and paper, flooding correspondence with densely argued, melancholic analyses. His letters brood over the fragility of republics, the seduction of demagogues, and the moral dangers of unchecked democracy. Illness shortened his time in Congress and hastened his retirement, but it also sharpened his sense that politics should be guided by prudence, not adrenaline. Friends saw in him a man whose frail body made him unusually aware of how quickly strong things can fail. In a culture that prized robust public performance, Ames's sickroom became a surprising workshop for some of federalism's fiercest pros. 95. Mercy Otis Warren's political salon. Mercy Otis Warren turned her Massachusetts home into something rarer than a public office, an informal ministry of ideas. While barred by custom from the legislative floor, she presided over evenings where governors, generals, and pamphleteers traded arguments by the hearth. Tea, manuscripts, and gossip moved together, with Mercy's sharp opinions and satirical verses quietly steering conversation. Her letters stitched this domestic salon into a wider network, carrying critiques of British policy and, later, of the Constitution itself. Men who thundered in assemblies often tested their arguments first in her parlor, where she answered with questions that cut to the bone. Her household duties ran alongside drafts of plays and histories that would shape how contemporaries understood the Revolution. Children, servants, and visiting politicians shared the same cramped domestic stage where public and private blurred. Warren's living room shows how political life in the founding era sometimes grew not from official chambers but from a woman's writing desk tucked near the fire. 96. Dolley Madison's turban and fashion identity. Dolley Madison understood that in a capital hungry for symbols, clothing could become a kind of soft power. Her bright turbans, bold colors, and lavishly trimmed gowns turned her into a walking landmark of the early republic. Guests entered presidential receptions already looking for the towering headdress that signaled hospitality and spectacle. In a political culture that distrusted monarchy yet craved ceremony, Dolley's style offered a compromise, Republican glamour without crowns. Her consistent look, a blend of Quaker-born poise and theatrical flair, became an early American brand, instantly recognizable in portraits and descriptions. It helped her smooth factions, charm opponents, and reassure foreign envoys that the new nation had social polish. Behind the feathers and silk sat a shrewd reader of people who knew that memory often attaches to images more than arguments. Dolley built a public identity from private wardrobe choices, proving that in Washington fashion could be a political tool. 97. Founders' letter sealing rituals. Before envelopes and security stamps, private letters traveled wrapped in layers of ritual meant to keep eyes out. Writers folded pages in intricate letter-locking patterns, tucking and slitting paper so any tampering left scars. Hot wax dripped onto seams, stamped with personal seals that functioned like passwords and signatures combined. A broken blob of wax or misaligned impression told recipients someone had peeked. Trusted couriers, family members, favored clerks, reliable ship captains were chosen like extensions of the writer's own hand. In an age of political intrigue and sprawling gossip networks, the physical mechanics of folding and sealing became part of how intimacy and secrecy were negotiated. 98. Household enslaved staff at founders' homes. Behind polished portraits of founders reading by the fire stood rooms full of people they legally owned. Enslaved housemaids, cooks, butlers, coachmen, and nurses kept the machinery of elite comfort humming largely without acknowledgement. They rose before dawn, managed fires, prepared elaborate meals, dressed children, and received guests whose letters later praised their hosts' gracious hospitality. These workers learned private schedules, overheard confidential conversations, and knew the rhythms of the household more intimately than many relatives. Some founders rented enslaved laborers to fill domestic gaps, turning human beings into line items in household budgets. The genteel privacy of early national drawing rooms rested on the constant, coerced presence of enslaved staff just out of the frame. 99. Frequent mourning in founding-era families. Founding households lived with death, not as an exception, but as a recurring season. Infants died from fevers, mothers from childbirth complications, siblings from outbreaks of smallpox, yellow fever, dysentery, and mysterious fluxes. Letters carry almost routine announcements of new graves, edged with black seals and formal phrases that barely mask exhaustion. Children grew up memorizing which ribbons, gloves, and jewelry signaled current mourning status. Parents named later babies after dead brothers and sisters, creating family trees where the same names appear, vanish, and reappear. Political correspondence is threaded with condolences, as public debates pause to acknowledge yet another funeral. For many founders, ambition, affection, and grief shared the same cramped hallways. 100. The gap between public myth and private messiness. Later generations carved the founders into marble, but their own papers preserve something far less tidy. Diaries show pettiness, jealousy, and depression alongside soaring rhetoric about virtue and liberty. Letters worry over debts, unruly children, aches, and the price of cloth while also sketching visions for the Republic's future. Some men celebrated for firmness agonized in private over hard choices. Others who thundered about sacrifice fretted over lost fees and appointments. They gossiped, flattered, sulked, and occasionally apologized. The distance between the myths in schoolbook paragraphs and the people in ink is wide. In those surviving pages, the founders look less like demigods and more like ambitious, anxious humans stumbling through enormous change.